declare this meeting in session. Welcome to this meeting of the Standing Senate Committee on National Security, Defence and Veterans Affairs. I'm Tony Dean, Senator from Ontario and the Chair of this committee. I'm joined today by fellow committee members and some other senators whom I welcome now to introduce themselves, beginning on my right. Senator Dagenet.
Jean-Guy Dagenet.
Jean-Guy Dagenet from Quebec.
Pierre-Hugues Boisvenu.
Senator Pierre-Hugues Boisvenu from Quebec.
I'm from Manitoba.
Senator, I'm from Ontario.
Andrew Cardozo from Ontario.
Senator Judy White, Newfoundland Labrador.
Welcome, Artie Deacon, Senator from Ontario.
Stan Couture, Nova Scotia.
Dave Richards, New Brunswick.
Julie Méville-de-Chêne, Québec.
Julie Méville-de-Chêne, Quebec.
Ontario.
Pat Duncan, Yukon.
Peter Beam, Ontario.
Donna Dasco, Senator from Ontario, and I'm a member of this committee. Thank you.
David Arnott, Senator from Saskatchewan.
Thank you, colleagues. We're also joined by the Clerk of the committee, Madame Dupont. For those watching the session today, we begin our study of Bill C21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments related to firearms. We have the pleasure of welcoming today the Honourable Dominic LeBlanc, Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. LeBlanc is accompanied by Mr. Talal, Dakalbab, Assistant Deputy Minister, Crime Prevention Branch, Public Safety, Mr. Matthew Taylor, General Counsel and Director of the Criminal Law Policy Section at Justice Canada, and Mark Flynn, Acting Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Thank you all for joining us today. Minister LeBlanc, welcome on behalf of the committee. I now invite you to provide your opening remarks. Please begin whenever you're ready.
Mr. Chair, Honourable Senators, good afternoon, and thank you for having us at your committee, and thank you for introducing my colleagues from the RCMP, the Public Safety Department, and the Department of Justice who've joined me, and there are other officials as well from different agencies, the Canadian Border Services Agency, for example, and others that I think you'll hear from once I exit your august committee. Mr. Chair, it's a pleasure, as always, to appear before you today, and I thank my colleagues for joining us. I see some old friends at your table. I'm an admirer of the work of what we call the other place. I have a family connection to your chamber. You'll see my father's portrait on the wall when he was Speaker, and he enjoyed immensely the time he served in the Senate, so it's always a privilege for me to be back at a place that he enjoyed so much. Mr. Chair, through legislative measures such as Bill C21, our government is aiming to tackle gun violence head-on. Since it was introduced last spring, Bill C21 has been further strengthened through extensive consultations and amendments. We engaged with First Nations, Inuit and Métis organizations, rural and northern communities, victims groups, and with the firearms community and sports persons and sports shooters across Canada to hear their perspectives and to ensure that we respect their traditions and way of life. These consultations have informed our path forward. Le projet de loi
Bill C21 stipulates explicitly from now on that nothing in the bill derogates from the constitutional rights of Indigenous peoples and includes protections for firearm owners who respect the law so that they can continue to practice, which has over the years become more than a hobby for them. We have also consulted with family members and communities that have been affected by gun violence. Unfortunately, the most vulnerable communities are often among those who are the most impacted by gun violence. We have to do everything that's within our power to ensure their safety and the safety of all Canadians, and the Bill C21 is an important step in this direction. It starts with fighting against the proliferation of handguns. Handguns are the type of firearms the most frequently used in homicides. This bill will enshrine in legislation the national freeze on handguns, which took effect via regulation in October 2022. It would also help us fight against organized crime by increasing the maximum penalties for firearm traffickers and by enabling new authorities to work and fight against counterfeit firearms. The bill will also tackle the phenomenon of ghost guns by further restricting the regulation around parts that are used to build these weapons.
To protect victims of intimate partner violence. Victims of intimate partner violence are almost 5 times more likely to be killed if a firearm is present in the home, highlighting the urgency of further curtailing access to firearms for violent individuals. New red flag laws in the bill will allow courts to order the immediate removal of firearms from dangerous individuals. The bill will also codify a technical definition of an assault-style firearm, which will make it illegal to import or manufacture such firearms in Canada going forward. This will enable us to proactively respond to technological advances in the firearms market and keep dangerous weapons, those that aren't used for hunting and sporting, from entering our communities. En complément de ces mesures, des modifications réglementaires.
In addition to these measures, regulation changes will be brought forward to impose a compulsory physical examination by the RCMP for all new models of firearms before they are made available in the Canadian market. These additional regulations will ensure that no firearm penetrates the Canadian market without having been classified correctly by government authorities that are competent in the matter. To deal with the problem of classification of firearms, we are re-establishing the Canadian Firearms Advisory Committee so that it looks into the classification of existing models independently. That will come under the new prospective definition of prohibited weapons as per Bill C21, and it will also identify those that are qualified as hunting weapons so that they will be excluded from a future order by which all existing assault-style firearms will be prohibited. And we are also reinforcing the regulation around cartridge magazines with a high capacity to get rid of the loopholes and the exemptions that allow access to cartridge magazines that contain more than 5 or 10 projectiles, respectively for handguns and long guns. This measure or other provisions of the bill or any other complementary measure is aiming to get rid of or ban the weapons of hunters or sports shooters. These are measures that aim to help us fight against gun violence. Each time there is a gun crime that is committed on our streets, it is the feeling of safety of the residents that is shaken.
Can address this issue alone. That is why we continue to pursue the implementation of an assault-style firearms buyback program. We are taking the time to get this program right and looking forward to keeping businesses and responsible gun owners apprised of the next steps as we move forward in this direction. At the same time, we are strengthening law enforcement's capacity to stop guns from coming into the country, investigating gun crimes, and enhance their collaboration with provincial and municipal law enforcement partners. And Mr. Chair, this is also a discussion I had with Secretary Mayorkas, the U.S. Homeland Security Secretary, when I was in Washington a few weeks ago, precisely how we can better share information at the border. The Canadian Border Services Agency with his department and how we can work together collaboratively to deal with the importation of illegal guns across the Canada-US border. Prevention is also a key pillar of our approach. In collaboration with provincial and territorial partners, we are supporting the development of new gun and gang violence prevention and intervention programs. These investments support prevention and intervention efforts aimed at young people, helping them leave gangs or avoid joining them in the first place. En investissant dans la prévention,
By investing in prevention and repression, we will improve public safety and avoid tragedies, and hopefully we'll be able to save lives as well.
21 is clearly but one element of a broader public safety agenda. We believe it is nonetheless a significant step forward towards enhancing the safety and security of Canadians. And we look forward to the work of this committee, and we hope that you'll be able to pursue us in these efforts. And I look forward to your questions today, and I thank so many colleagues for coming to a meeting on a Monday afternoon. If this was a committee in the other place, you'd have maybe a third of the attendance here. So it's either a good sign, Mr. Chair, or a very bad sign for me, but I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you, Minister. We're about to find out shortly, I think. We'll now proceed to questions. Before proceeding, just a caution. I'd like to ask participants in the room to please refrain from leaning in too closely to the microphone or to remove your earpiece when doing this. This will avoid any sound feedback that could negatively impact the committee staff in the room. I note that Minister LeBlanc will be here with us until 5 p.m. today. We're going to do our best to allow time for each member to ask a question during this first hour. A second round of questions with officials will take place from 5 to 6 p.m. With this in mind, 4 minutes is going to be allocated for each question, including the answer. I ask that you keep your questions succinct in an effort to allow as many interventions as possible. That being said, I now offer the first question to our Deputy Chair, Senator Dagenet.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being with us. I am going to reassure you because I will vote in favor of C21, so I'm seeing you smile. There is one deception that I have. It has been 8 years that the government has been in power, and I am under the impression that when it comes to organized crime, the impact it doesn't maybe go far enough, because we're looking at going after firearm traffickers and strengthening border controls, but we're also talking about identifying prohibited firearms, which is a bit complicated. And under C21, I'm not sure that there will be a reduction in terms of the firearms used by criminals to commit homicides, because if we could have members of organized crime who could come to testify before us, I think C21 would look a lot different. So I'm not going to call it a lack of courage, but in the bill, you see the rights of hunters and sports shooters being limited. So who are you trying to please with Bill C21 is my question, I think. Thank you, Senator, for the question. My colleagues from the Ministry and the RCMP, if they want to chime in, I think that will be all right. We, as the government, believe that this is an important measure to protect the population. We believe, for instance, that additional authorities and additional resources that we're providing to the CBSA will mean that we will deal more effectively with organized crime. And Senator, of course, you have a lot of knowledge when it comes to public safety, and this will be an opportunity for us to strengthen our law enforcement agencies to fight against what is becoming a common problem, organized crime. I do agree with you on that. We are not aiming, as I said, to limit the rights of hunters or sports shooters with the provisions contained in the document. I know hunters in New Brunswick who use traditional hunting weapons, and we are explicitly saying that we are not at all aiming these sorts of groups. We are going after weapons that are manufactured to kill people in a military conflict setting, for instance. We understand, and you're absolutely right, that fighting against organized crime and preventing gun violence cannot only be achieved by a simple bill, but it's an important tool. But I do believe that we will see a reduction in terms of the long guns in circulation. It will also help police. It also takes police services, prosecutors, other provincial police, for instance, Sûreté du Québec, and others, and it will also take continued discussion, which I have with my colleagues from the RCMP to find out how we can support our partners. Well, there is a difference between assault-style weapons and hunting weapons, and I was doing some research. I came across this website. I brought you a copy too. There is a shooting range and a sports shooting club in Kanawaki, and I think they are using some of the weapons that you saw in the hands of terrorists in Israel a couple weeks ago. And you can pay a certain amount to go there for an hour, use automatic rifles that can shoot 20 projectiles or 20 bullets in a matter of seconds. So these are very strong weapons, and these are definitely not the tools that hunters will use. But what kinds of monitoring will there be on these sorts of weapons? I can provide the copy to the gentleman from the RCMP too. So I've already been at a shooting range rather, but I had never seen this sort of weaponry being used before.
Up for this period. It's a guide to other members to, I think, be brief with questions. I'm hoping that officials, this is a good question, I'm hoping that this is an answer that can be provided in the course of this meeting. I'm sure it will be. We're now going to senators, starting with Senator O, followed by Senators Plett, Cardozo, Youssef and Kuchar. Senator O.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here. My question is, Minister, gun control is ultimately about controlling legal firearms. If gun control is going to be effective, it must have the support of legal firearms owners. It is very obvious that legal firearms owners are very opposed to this bill. Indigenous people are opposed to the bill. Many frontline police officers have said it will be ineffective. Question for you. How concerned are you that pushing this bill through regardless, you are in fact undermining support for gun controls in Canada?
Senator, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. My colleagues say, with respect to Senator Dagenet, they will have the technical answers because I share his surprise at exactly that, but they'll be happy to come back to that. But with respect to your question, Senator, it may not surprise you. I don't think that Indigenous peoples writ large oppose this bill, and I don't think to say that hunters or sports groups oppose this legislation. There is, every time governments or Parliament legislate in this area, a very quick reaction from hunting groups, sports shooters, many of whom are in my constituency in rural New Brunswick. That's why I think it's important for us to continue to explain and to be able to point in the legislation to why these particular legislative measures, first of all, respect completely Indigenous rights. That's a part that we amended, we added to the bill, because I think in an initial version of this legislation, much of what you identified in your question was a very real concern. That's why I think the legislative process in our place, I hope, to a large extent, attenuated or diminished those concerns. So we are entirely respective of Indigenous Section 35 rights, and we're designing legislation that deliberately targets those who use weapons or want to have weapons that are not, in fact, part of a typical hunter or sports person's routine. So I think that there's broad support in Canada for thoughtful, effective measures to reduce the proliferation and access to military-style assault weapons. Now, I'm not a firearms expert. We have people from the RCMP and others that understand these details better than I do. But I think Canadians in general, having seen tragedies across the country and around the world when these weapons are in the hands of criminals, I think that any measure that reduces the number of these guns that are circulating in communities or that can be imported into Canada or can be sold lawfully, I think is a step in the right direction. But as I said, it requires a series of measures, not simply one legislative measure around gun control.
Minister, the gun control, I think the most important thing is illegal gun coming across from the border. I think those are the serious problems they're creating. I'm from GTA, Toronto, and that's where most of the illegal guns are coming through and being used by the gangs.
So, Senator, I agree with you that that is a significant challenge. As I said in my opening comments, it was, I thought, an interesting discussion I had with the Secretary of Homeland Security in the United States, with the Attorney General of the United States as well. They want the FBI and their border services partners of the Canadian Border Services Agency to work collaboratively with the RCMP and Canadian law enforcement. We had a federal, provincial, and territorial meeting of public safety ministers in Bromont, Quebec, 2 weeks ago. Weeks get blurred. A couple of weeks ago. This was the Quebec minister, Bonardel, very much wanted us to work precisely on some of these points at the border. I think we can do a lot more, and we will.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator O. Senator Plett is next.
Thank you, and I will be succinct. I hope I can get both of my questions in. If the minister will cooperate with me on this, maybe I can get them both in. Minister, you talked briefly in your opening remarks about engagement with Indigenous communities. We, in fact, have a submission from the Mohawk Council of Kaunaki in which they stated there was no consultation. Let me just very briefly read what they say. There is no carve-out in Bill C21 for the exercise of this inherent jurisdiction, nor was any consultation carried out to solicit our import. Other Indigenous groups, of course, have reported the same. How is that possible, Minister, when this bill clearly impacts them? They are saying no consultation. You are saying engagement.
So, again, Mr. Chair, through you to Senator Plett, that's a very good question. I, again, believe that the elements of this bill, and it's stated clearly in the legislation, are respectful of Indigenous rights. My predecessor, Marco Mendicino, had a series of consultations with Indigenous groups. Talal and I have a list here. We're happy to share that with you, Senator, because it's a good question. I see a number of Indigenous communities that were met with in the winter and spring of this year. With respect to the particular community, Talal, do you have an answer for the Senator?
I'm not going to touch it. Happy to jump in. Actually, I'd like to clarify as well. The bill as it stands right now, there were extensive consultations with Indigenous communities across the country when it was introduced the first time. Exactly.
The question was on this bill.
And this bill as well, when there were amendments introduced, we did further consultation, but most of these amendments were removed from this bill. But I'm happy to share with you the consultations we did.
Thank you. My next question, Minister, you talked about wanting to take the guns, the illegal guns out of criminals, and I don't think there's anybody around this table that doesn't support that. But this, of course, this bill isn't dealing with illegal guns in the hands of criminals. This bill is dealing with legal guns in the hands of hunters and sport shooters. But, you know, if the government is so set on combating gun crime, and your predecessor claimed that your government's goal with this bill is the eradication of gun violence. But under your government, Minister, Bill C5, you have in fact repealed mandatory sentences for the following: using a firearm or imitation firearm in the commission of an offense, possession of a firearm or weapon knowing its possession is unauthorized, possession of a prohibited or restricted firearm with ammunition, possession of a weapon obtained by commission of an offense, discharging a firearm with intent, robbery with a firearm, and extortion with a firearm. So I'm wondering, Minister, how is this consistent with your goal in trying to eradicate gun violence when you remove, and I know you're going to say they've increased maximum penalties when the 10-year maximum was never handed out in the first place. So increasing maximum isn't what we're concerned about. You've taken away minimums. Why is that, Minister?
So, Senator, again, just to go back to the initial part of your second question, it won't surprise you I don't agree with your characterization that we're taking guns away from lawful hunters and sports persons. That phrase gets repeated over and over again. It doesn't make it true. I just think I want to be careful to make it clear that I disagree with the premise of that question. You talked about legislation that Parliament adopted over a year ago. Matthew can go through some of the specific elements of Bill C5. We may have a fundamental difference of opinion with respect to the appropriate use of mandatory minimum sentences. I voted as a member of Parliament for a number of mandatory minimum sentences. And I also voted for legislation that I believe brought them in line with some of the constitutional provisions of various court decisions. I would also point, Senator, to the fact that we have given $900 million to provinces and territories precisely to improve law enforcement's ability, our partner law enforcement agencies, to go after the illegal guns and criminals who are using guns. I'd share your premise, Senator, entirely with respect to the fact that the focus has to be on the illegal use of firearms to commit criminal offenses. That should unite us all. On that, I think you and I would agree quite easily.
Thanks, Minister. Senator Cardozo is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here. What I'd like to do is just to read you a couple of paragraphs of interventions that we received and get your input, because that's, at the end of the day, what we have to pass judgment on. So this is from the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, and this is one of the quotations I want to make. The prohibition of semi-automatic guns will do nothing to prevent crime, as it will not curtail the demand for illicit firearms by guns and those involved in organized crime. They go on to say that tangible benefits to public safety will require non-legislative efforts, including increased funding for border services, improved firearm tracing, and initiatives to tackle gun activity and organized crime. So maybe I can just get your thought on that, and I then want to provide you a quote from the other side of the discussion.
Well, thank you, Senator, for the question. And so, as I said in response to Senator Plett, we do share the view that we have to increase the ability of law enforcement, both on the federal side, the RCMP, the Border Services Agency, but also with our provincial and municipal partners and some Indigenous police forces, so to collaborate with law enforcement to share information, our American partners, as I mentioned. So I accept their view that we also need to invest in the appropriate law enforcement instruments to cut down on the illegal importation of firearms, but to remove what, as we said, are firearms designed not for sports shooting or for hunting, but are designed for in a battlefield context that we don't think should be circulating freely in communities in Canada. And again, I think that the premise that this affects law-abiding gun owners is a phrase that's often used, who pursue sports activities, hunting or sports shooting. We have been explicit and careful to ensure that these measures do not target those people, and in fact allow them to practice their sport and other recreational activities that hunters in my community of rural New Brunswick do, while at the same time giving law enforcement and prosecutors the ability to deal with a particular kind of weapon that has caused much death and destruction in Canada, but to deal with things like ghost guns, to deal with other elements that we think recognize technology evolving and modernize the legislative framework so that police are able to better control those kind of guns.
Thanks very much. Just quickly then, Police se souvient have a different perspective. They'd like the bill passed as soon as possible. And they add, we also hope senators communicate to the government their support for strong regulations aimed at banning current military-style weapons and eliminating all exemptions and loopholes that undermine the so-called ban on large-capacity magazines.
So I had an opportunity to speak to representatives of Police se Souvient earlier today. In fact, I'm going to meet with them in the coming weeks, I hope in Montreal. I share absolutely their concern. They've expressed it to me. They've expressed it to our department. That's why in my opening comments, I thought it was important to publicly commit the government to a series of regulatory, once the bill receives royal assent, obviously, work with the appropriate authorities to put quickly into place a regulatory framework that we think will answer many of those questions or many of those concerns that Police se Souvient and other groups representing victims of gun violence have advocated for. So I think that we're very much lined up with that sentiment and will do so in an expeditious way should and when this bill receive royal assent.
Thanks very much, Minister. Senator Youssef is next, followed by Senator Kuchar and Anderson. Senator Youssef.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister and witnesses, for being here. Minister, I have a couple of questions. I'll try to be as direct and succinct as I can, and maybe I might get them answered. If not, I'll follow up with your officials. So, amendments were introduced in the other place to ensure that the provision enacted through C21 are to be constructing as upholding Aboriginal and treaty rights of Indigenous people as recognized and affirmed, of course, by Section 35 of the Constitution, not by abrogating or derogating from them. Can you confirm and explain how treaty rights will be affected by C21?
So through you, Mr. Chair, Senator Youssef, thank you for the question and thank you for your willingness to sponsor this legislation. So we appreciate it and look forward to working with you and your colleagues in this place. Since last fall, as I mentioned, we have been engaging with Indigenous partners across the country, including Indigenous partners in the Northern Territories as well. I think we understand and certainly can assure those Indigenous peoples that firearms that have been used and passed down for generations in their pursuit of sustenance, hunting, for example, or other activities that they have done lawfully for generations will not be affected, will be untouched by this legislation. These traditions are important for Canadians and Indigenous peoples. This bill won't prevent the pursuit of those traditions. We also thought it was important precisely because of some of the concern when the initial bill was presented, and I think that you're referring to that, to add a non-derogation clause to reaffirm without question that Section 35 constitutional rights of Indigenous people are to be upheld. This definition was co-developed with national Indigenous organizations and reaffirms what we all have known, that the constitutions and rights that Indigenous people hold need to remain protected and should not be affected by a legislative measure. We don't propose in this legislation to take away any firearms that Indigenous people use to hunt or trap. And it's something, as Talal mentioned, my predecessor in this portfolio worked on a lot in the spring, but it's work that I'm going to continue to do. And in fact, I had this conversation with Northern premiers. I'm also the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister. In my conversations with Northern premiers, this issue has also been raised, and I'm happy to work with them and other groups across the country.
Bill C21 is not without controversy, to say the least, and being the sponsor of the bill, I've got an earful from on both sides of the spectrum on this. And yes, now a lot has been said on both sides of the spectrum in regard to what the bill is and isn't to a large extent. And as a country, I think my colleague Senator Plett said this earlier in his remarks, and I think Senator O said the same thing. I mean, Canadians are concerned, especially in urban environment, about gun violence. It's a real issue, and it's hard not to go an evening or a day without not hearing of gun violence in our society. So, how do we dialogue with each other in a way that respects the need for legislation that's going to help, of course, protect Canadians from the harm that we see all the time? And secondly, how do we find, I guess, the fortitude to recognize there are things we need to do as a society for the greater good of society, especially on the question of gun violence? Because we live to our neighbors to the south, who have a different perspective on this issue, and I hope that we don't fall in the trap. So maybe from your responsibility as minister and intergovernment minister.
30 seconds, it would be appreciated.
I like the way when Senator Youssef began, he said, if I don't know the answers, he can get them from the officials after I leave. So, so Senator, your question, and this is the struggle of successive governments in this space. It's not new to our government. Legislating in this area brings with it understandable reactions from people who are concerned. There is a significant amount of misinformation that circulates in this space as well. Some of it, as you say, is fueled by an American constitutional provision or American interests that come across the border and in social media, on the internet. So it's not easy to have, in many cases, a conversation that identifies exactly the balance, Senator, that I think you expressed that many Canadians share. How do we respect the rights of lawful, law-abiding sports persons, hunters that use firearms in a perfectly appropriate way, but also deal with the increasing challenge of gun violence, including the use of weapons, and the RCMP and others can speak to this, that are increasingly violent, military-style assault rifles, that some of the crime scenes and some of the investigations that the RCMP have told me they're doing are involving increasingly high-powered, violent, or high-powered weapons that are being used to perpetrate violence with devastating consequences. So law enforcement needs new tools and modern tools, and we think that this bill is part of the step, part of that, of those steps in that direction. But we recognize that there's still be more work to do once this legislation, we hope, gets royal assent, because there are things that will constantly evolve as the threat evolves.
Thank you. Thanks, Minister. Senator Kuchar.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being with us. Like others around the table, I've received hundreds and hundreds of emails from concerned Canadians, and I want to thank them for reaching out. My question is to seek your response to two of the issues that I have raised with me. The first issue that I hear about over and over again is that this bill will not impact criminals in illegal use of guns, and therefore it's unnecessary and unwarranted, which is a different perspective than what I read on the Public Safety Canada website, which says this bill is part of a comprehensive strategy to address gun violence and strengthen gun control in Canada. So these are quite different, and I'd like you to comment on that. And then the second part of this question is that this bill takes away the property rights of Canadians to own guns. I'm aware of the 1993 Supreme Court ruling that found that Canadians do not have a constitutional right to own firearms, and the arguments that owning guns is a privilege, not a right. But I wonder if you could help clarify the issue around property rights and the guns.
So, Senator, thank you for the question. Thank you for the work you're doing on a series of issues across the country that are important to me and to many people. So I laud you for that work and thank you. I said to Deputy Commissioner Flynn, maybe he can go into the specific difference between what may be on the Public Security Department website and what we believe is an important tool for law enforcement to have in the continued fight against the illegal use and violent use of firearms. The second part, if I can, Senator, just your question around property rights, I'm glad you used that phrase, because that is an example, I think, of some of the confusion that comes from our neighbors to the south. They're 10 times our size. They're very loud on these issues. I have people that come to my constituency office sometimes and talk about whether a grand jury is going to indict somebody. And that comes from watching American TV shows. So there's a lot of confusion around some legal concepts that have their roots in American constitutional law. You referred to a Supreme Court case. It's not an issue of property rights. It's an issue of responsible criminal law enacted by Parliament to keep Canadians safe. That's how we look at this particular question. And I think that that's an importation of an American phrase that, and I'm not a constitutional law expert, we have Matthew in the Department of Justice perhaps can give you more. I don't think that that has a lot of application in the criminal code changes in Canada, but he could go into that, Senator, on more detail. But Mark, did you want to pick up on the first part of the Senator's question?
Yeah, so I'll just provide a little bit of information that I hope will help characterize our view or my view on this. So gang-related homicides involving firearms increased by 27% in 2021. Okay. Also, if you look at the number of firearms that we've traced through our tracing efforts, 69% of those firearms were deemed to have legally been imported or manufactured in Canada. So when you combine those two facts together, you see that legal firearms that are in Canada are likely contributing to the pool of firearms that are being used in gang-related and organized crime homicides. So anything that helps from a policing perspective remove the available resources for gangs and organized crime to commit these violent acts is beneficial for public safety and obviously the police and our mandate to enforce the law.
Let's move to Senator Anderson, who will be followed by Senator Deakin, Ontario, Senator Dasco and Senator Beam. Senator Anderson.
Plenini, Chair, and thank you, Minister LeBlanc, for your attendance. Minister LeBlanc, you spoke about recognizing and upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples. Yet in Bill C21 under Section 110.1 sub 1, there are processes for an ex parte application to a provincial court for an order prohibiting another person from possessing any firearm, crossbow, prohibited weapon, restricted weapon, prohibited device, ammunition, prohibited ammunition, or explosive substances, or all such things if the person believes on reasonable grounds that it's not desirable in the interests of the safety of the person against whom the order is sought, or of any person that the person against whom the order is sought should possess any such thing. So this is the ex parte. So this is at the risk of further creating disparities in the three territories, in the Northwest Territories, Nunavut and the Yukon, and criminalizing individuals. I point out to you that in domestic cases, there is a suspicion of probable cause, whereas in Bill C21 works on reasonable grounds, quote, not desirable in the interest of the safety of the person against whom the order is sought, end of quote. In Bill C21, there appears to be a presumption of guilt when there are no reasonable grounds to have proven that there has been an offense committed. This is problematic. And I want to point out that Minister LeBlanc, you spoke a lot about hunters and sport hunters. For some, this goes beyond hunting and sport hunting, and that's the case for the Northwest Territories, Nunavut and the Yukon. This is how we survive. This is how we feed our families, a matter of ensuring food security for our families and for our communities. So to be lumped in with sport hunters and hunters is not a clear definition. In the North, we also have traveling courts with intermittent scheduled courts in the communities, as well as 2 to 3 generations who live in the same home, and a reliance in many communities to ensure safety from predatory animals, as well as subsistence hunting to address food security and disparities we face in the North. Can you tell me, between the mandate, UNDRIP, and addressing systemic inequities and disparities, how Bill C21, given what I have just stated, have factored and taken into account the realities in the Northwest Territories, Nunavut and the Yukon?
So, Senator, thank you for the questions, plural, because there are a number of very good questions. So I wouldn't purport to say we've lumped in sports persons or hunters in the South with, as you properly note, residents in the North for whom hunting is very much food security. I was Minister of Northern Affairs for a number of months and learned a great deal about food security, the Northern Food Program, and totally accept your premise that for many people in Canada's North, that the access to firearms is very much a question of food security and a traditional way of life that we want to respect. And we believe that this legislation entirely supports and respects that particular issue. The front part of your question, Senator, and as I say, we had a number of consultations with Northern governments, Northern Indigenous groups, and my colleagues would be happy to share with you an extensive list of people from whom we sought input. But at the front end of your question, you were identifying, I think, the provisions of the law around the red flag provisions. And again, Matthew will very quickly, Mr. Chair, the question was long. I'll try and keep the answer short. But I want Matthew to be able, I think, to explain what my instinct, having not practiced in this area of law before, it's not a criminal finding. It's not this is about giving law enforcement a chance on a protective basis for a temporary order to remove a firearm, as opposed to a criminal. We're not criminalizing people. We're trying to protect potential victims in a way, but I totally I've had friends that worked on circuit courts in the north. It is a different context, and maybe Matthew could explain. I just wouldn't want us to look like we're criminalizing people when we're in fact trying to protect potential victims of domestic violence by a temporary order. Matthew?
Thank you, Minister. And sorry, but maybe we can come back to this in the second part. If we could, we have to move on. We've got 5 senators still waiting on the list. Senator Deakin, Ontario, is next, followed by Senator Daska.
Thank you, and hello, Minister and officials and support. Thank you for all of you being here today. 2 questions I hope I can get in. One, you've heard it, we've heard from many, many Canadians and non-Canadians, and we've met with many groups and many, many Canadians, and great range. For me, the youngest was a 7-year-old boy and a 93-year-old woman. That represents quite a diversity, I think, in this country. And one of the common, if you look at distill everything we have and everything we receive, one of the most common pieces that comes to us is that farmers will not be able to farm, do their work, and that hunters will not be able to hunt and do their work. Just a quick response, and if you have those Canadians in front of you, what would you be saying to them?
Senator, thank you for the question. I think that assertion is not accurate, and I've heard it as you have and as we all have. People assert that farmers or people in rural communities that need firearms for pest control purposes and other hunters, sports persons, people using firearms in northern and Indigenous communities, they're not targeted or affected or included in these measures that we're trying to have adopted to specifically go after persons using weapons that are designed specifically to kill the greatest number of people in the shortest amount of time. I have cousins in New Brunswick that go hunting for moose. They don't go to war with moose. This is a fundamental difference. So I think that, but I'm not surprised. I've been sitting in Parliament for 23 years. I've seen various versions of gun control measures. Accuracy and reliability in terms of what people say is often lost in the opening moments of this conversation. That's fine. I'm serene with that. We're doing the best we can in a minority parliament to have legislation adopted that we think makes a significant difference in protecting communities and people. But we recognize that there's more to be done, and we'll continue to work with parliamentarians in both places to figure out the best way forward.
Thank you, and I think we're all trying to refine, define, try to work through disinformation. So here's maybe a part B for this too. When we look at some of the communication we've had, and that is, no doubt there's a concern in our sport shooting communities about this legislation. And while there isn't exemptions for elite level Olympian shooters, there's still confusion about how such labels will be determined, and also if someone will be the last generation of sport shooters in Canada because novices would be unable to train at this level. I have led many shooters into this country in big multi-sport games. They are unique athletes, and they're so proud to wear that leaf on their back. How are we going to make sure they're still able to do that?
Senator, very, very good question. And I, in my briefings and understanding of the legislation, was very reassured that we're not affecting the ability of these elite athletes to access the firearms they need for their sporting competitions. And it's not only the persons that go to these international competitions representing Canada, it's those that are training and getting ready for one day, hopefully having the opportunity to do that. But Talal, you and I talked about this just to reassure the Senator with respect to the elite sport shooters.
Absolutely. And we've been discussing this for a while now with Parliament and with the stakeholders as well. Obviously, I believe you're referring to the handgun freeze and not to the long guns, but the assault-style firearms. The handgun freeze will have provisions that will be more detailed in regulations, so further consultations will take place to clearly establish the process for exactly the sport shooter and the people who will be training on how we will establish it. The legislation right now is giving the framework from a legal perspective, but further regulations will come and will continue, right? Go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
you.
Senator Dasko is next. I'm sure we'll be coming back to this one later. Senator Dasko.
Thank you, Minister and officials, for being here. And, you know, this is a very important bill. I live in Toronto. There have been so many incidents of gun crime, and yet Toronto is a safe city, and yet we hear these stories all the time, so it's very scary for us, for those of us who live there and want to continue to live in a safe community. I wanted to explore a little deeper the issue of assault-style weapons. The bill includes a ban on future assault-style weapons, but does not affect those that are currently in circulation and are currently legal. And I would like just to get a better sense of what are your plans to deal with existing assault weapons. Last fall, you introduced in amendments a list of 482 models that you felt were dangerous. I would like to get a commitment from you that those guns are going to be made illegal. And I want to know a real commitment from you as to how that's going to be handled. We just, you know, the situation is just not acceptable to have tens of thousands of guns out there that are illegal, and we're talking just about the guns that we're going to deal with down the road. So anyway, that's my question.
So, Mr. Chair, through you to Senator Dasko, and you're right, your city, like other large Canadian cities, has seen an alarming increase, as Deputy Commissioner Flynn said, in these violent crimes, many of them, not all of them, using some of these weapons that we're seeking to prohibit. So I think a couple of points, perhaps. The firearms, the buyback provisions, many people purchased lawfully a gun that was available that they ordered from a distributor. Many of them received them by Canada Post. Guns that, by the order in Council, we now want to prohibit. So we need an appropriate way to, if we're going to remove these guns from people who purchased them lawfully, we need the appropriate way to compensate them, and that's exactly what the buyback program will do. The issue about, and that's 1,500 and some models. Talal and others could, Senator, give you the precise numbers in terms of the models that will no longer be lawfully permitted. But this is an evolving space, as you said, and the technology and the manufacturers are designing, whether it's magazine size, you can modify a particular magazine. A number of these things need to form part of a regulatory package following royal assent. We think having the Firearms Advisory Committee of experts is precisely a way to deal with that group of weapons. Putting them 482 in a legislative amendment at the other place was going to ensure that we weren't going to get this legislation adopted. So in a minority parliament, we worked with opposition parties and came up with what we thought is a thoughtful compromise that moves us in the direction that you articulated, for which I am totally in agreement. But the Firearms Advisory Committee will be a way to get expert advice on how to, in the regulatory context that Talal spoke about a minute ago, ensure that we're continuing the process of removing these guns that don't have a place in the lawful pursuit of sports activities or sustenance hunting, and that are causing such threat and concern and so much carnage in cities like the great city of Toronto.
Thank you, Minister. I'm looking at the clock. We've got 3 more senators. We've got time for 2 senators, Beam and Boisvenu. If we have very succinct questions and succinct answers. So Senator Beam is first. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I will be succinct. Minister, good to see you. Thanks for being here with your team. Most of my questions have already been asked, but I just wanted to make one observation and then a question. This bill is a very controversial bill. We all know that. It has traveled back and forth through the other place, which we call the other place, your place. Amendments have been put in, amendments have been withdrawn. You're new in the portfolio, so you've inherited this. It's with us now. You mentioned that you're still meeting with groups. You're seeing Police Souvien. And my question is, there will have to be an outreach campaign on this when this legislation is passed, as I'm assuming it will be, whether it's amended or not. Are you meeting with the sports shooting federations, with the hunting groups and associations and others who have a very valid interest in how this bill is going to be applied?
Mr. Chair, so through you to Senator Beam, it's a privilege to see you, Senator. I had a chance to work with Senator Beam when I was a young assistant in Mr. Chrétien's office 30 years ago, Senator Beam.
I was the same age then.
So I'm very happy to see you and very happy to say to you in unequivocal terms the answer is yes, because we share your view that as we look at regulatory changes, we hope the legislation, as I said, gets to royal assent, but the regulatory work is not done. There'll be government programs around prevention. There'll be the buyback program, which is a complicated space to operate in. So we'll have to continue in a thoughtful way to respect all of the groups who have very legitimate concerns. We think and hope we can answer their concerns, and we'll continue to diligently work down that list and ensure that it's balanced for exactly the reasons you said.
Thank you. Senator Boivin.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Minister. So when it comes to the program that has to do with illegal weapons, the Parliamentary Budget Officer referred to an amount of $550 million. Do you agree with that amount? Are you talking about the buyback program's cost that has just been extended to until 2025? Yes, the amnesty period has been extended in order not to criminalize. So the amount of $550 million that was given to us by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, is that the right amount, in your opinion? While we are finalizing the modalities of our program, I've seen drafts at the department. We're working on these. We're working with partners. I've talked to Minister Bonardel of Quebec at length about this, about bringing Sûreté du Québec on board. So there are details to be sorted out. That's why we have not announced the final modalities of our buyback program. Obviously, we are mindful of the cost, but it's a promise we made during the last elections, and we fully have the intention of creating this program. We are aware of the costs involved, but the Parliamentary Budget Officer hasn't seen the details of our program, not to take anything away from his capacity of providing analyses. But my question is that, Minister, the union of prison guards, they told us they intercepted hundreds of millions of dollars of worth firearms, and illegal firearms are a big problem in Canada. And the union told me that it's been 8 years that they have been asking the department for sufficient equipment to be able to intercept these weapons that are putting in danger the safety of prison guards and other detained, and they have been telling us that nothing has been done over the past 8 years in terms of improving the equipment. So I do not. So gangs in prisons are finding ways to obtain weapons, and the bill doesn't seem to remedy that. Well, in my first contact with the Commissioner for Correctional Services, we talked about this For instance, the use of drones is something that criminals have jumped on to transport drugs, for instance, or firearms in certain cases, or other weapons in the prison setting. There is a federal prison in Dorchester in my riding, which I've visited many times as an MP, so I'm aware of these worries. And I am meeting representatives of the union Thursday in Montreal, so I'm looking forward to that conversation. But I don't think it takes legislative measures. It takes tools and financing and support to the extraordinary people who work in the correctional services, the people I've met over the years. Of course, they are facing difficult times, increasing problems with safety in their work environment. So I will do anything in my power to help them, including providing them with the necessary tools and technologies, because safety within these institutions, of course, should concern everyone, because we have thousands and thousands of people who are facing these threats on a day-by-day basis.
But, Mr. Chair, was there one more senator at a question?
There was. You're absolutely right.
Si la sénateur Méville-Deschênes.
If Senator Méville-Deschênes wants to ask the question, of course, not to intervene with the chair's decision, but I'd be happy to answer the question. I'd like you to be kind with me, so I'll make this fast, Minister. So, Police Surveillant talked about their concerns when it comes to assault-style weapons specifically. So you have chosen to ban certain of these weapons by regulation. So can you provide us with assurances? Because you have been telling that there's an advisory committee that will look into it and make decisions. But can we expect that 6 months after the entry into force of the bill, of the law, that we will have with this regulation, or maybe within a time frame up to a full year, but will we have the regulation 6 months, let's say, after the entry into force, or worst case scenario after a year? Because otherwise we know that these things take a while, and when it drags, it ends up with deficiencies. Well, I have shared this information with representatives of Police Surveillant this morning. I do understand the sense of urgency. It wouldn't be acceptable that 2 or 3 years after the coming into force that is not finished. That wouldn't be acceptable. So we will act as swiftly as possible. There are other delays as well on the electoral front too, which maybe are of concern for you here too, but we are aware of the issue. I would be disappointed if it takes us a year. I'm not trying to avoid answering your question. It's a very good question, and I do have a lot of respect for the point you have raised. So the regulatory process, and I saw this when I was with the Treasury Board, there are notice periods, consultations, but it should not be a pretext for a delay or for not getting that done as quickly as possible. I'm looking at Talal, but I would be very surprised that if within a year, if it's not done, I'd be very surprised. But of course, there's the legal procedure, the Act, the Canada Gazette, so I'm not really going to give you a specific time frame. Can you not make a promise at this point? Well, Senator, of course, we do have that promise, of course, but I would be as disappointed as you if it's not done within a year. Thank you.
For being with us today. Colleagues, this brings us to the end of our time with Minister LeBlanc. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for the extra time, and thank you for the work you do in this job and the other jobs that have been assigned to you. So we're very grateful to you. Senators, Mr. Dakalbab, Mr. Taylor and Mr. Flynn have agreed to stay behind and will continue answering our questions for the remainder of the panel. And they'll be joined at the table at the very least by McCrorie, Vice President, Intelligence and Enforcement at the Canada Border Services Agency. We'll now suspend briefly to see the Minister out of the room. beginning our study of Bill C21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments to firearms. This past hour, we've heard from the Minister of Public Safety and Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs, Dominic LeBlanc, on this topic, and we now continue our questions with government officials from Public Safety, Justice Canada, Canada Border Services Agency, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Please note that two other officials in the gallery may be called to table to answer questions if required. Moving forward, I ask that members identify to whom each question is being directed wherever possible. The next question comes from Senator Plett.
Thank you, Chair. And my question is for the CBSA officials. A principal task for the Canadian Border Service is combating firearms smuggling, and it's obviously a serious problem since the current chief of the Toronto Police Service, Myron Dempkew, has stated about 86% of crime guns seized in Toronto were smuggled from the United States. He further stated that handguns on the Toronto streets, and I quote, "They're not domestically sourced, they're internationally sourced. Our problem in Toronto is handguns from the United States." CBSA, I think, has received about $86 million in funding in budgets 2018, 2021. Given that cross-border firearm smuggling is clearly the problem, in your view, does CBSA have sufficient resources to effectively combat this problem, and are you confident and pleased with the results that you are achieving today?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. The mandate, as you note, of CBSA is both to facilitate goods, but also to ensure public safety and security, and it's in that role that we're taking on the issue of gun smuggling. We have received money through budgets 2018 and 2021. You're correct, around $85 million and about $14 million ongoing. And what that has done is it's given us the tools to implement our firearms strategy. It's built around, first and foremost, being intelligence-driven, and so we've got increased capacity to deliver on to develop intelligence to guide our efforts. It's based on collaboration, so working very closely with our domestic partners like the RCMP, for example, but also police of local jurisdiction. Recently, we worked with the Sûreté de Quebec on Project Reproduction, and it's giving us tools like X-ray machines in post offices, X-ray machines in air cargo, dog detector teams to detect firearms. I should also note in terms of collaboration, working very closely with U.S. partners as well. So we recently signed an MOU with the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Administration to facilitate information exchanges. And we chair with the U.S. the Cross-Border Firearms Task Force that has undertaken a joint threat risk assessment and some joint projects to interdict both those receiving firearms, but also target the sources of those firearms in the United States.
Sir, but my question is, are you pleased with the results you're achieving? Not what you're all doing.
Yeah.
Are you getting enough money? Clearly, I would suggest that when the Toronto Police Chief has said about 86% of crime guns seized in the city were smuggled firearms, I would suggest that we are not getting on top of the smuggling problem. So I understand what all you're doing, but are you succeeding? Are you having success in what you're doing?
We can always do more, but we are making a difference. Last year, 2022, we had 540 seizures that resulted in the seizure of 540 seizure activities that represented 1,100 firearms. This year, year to date, 560 seizures where we see 777 firearms. Those are at the border and post-border where we conduct investigations. And one of the key elements of what we do, and this is why we talk about being intelligence-driven, is each one of those seizures in turn leads to new intelligence and new leads that either we can pursue or in partnership with partners like the RCMP and like police of local jurisdiction affect additional seizures domestically. So is there more to do? Absolutely. But the results we're seeing to date are a great success, and we're very proud of it.
Time for another one?
I'm afraid not, Senator.
Put me on the list again.
We go next to Senator Duncan.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all the witnesses that are here with us today. I'd like to start with Mr. Flynn, if I might. The legislation repeatedly references the chief firearms officers in the provinces. the chief firearms officer for the Yukon's located in Surrey, BC, for Northwest Territories in Edmonton, and in Nunavut in Winnipeg. That's a long way to go when you're trying to enforce or administer the legislation. I don't want to use the word necessarily enforcement. While there's capability to delegate, I believe in the legislation, and I've looked through that, that places yet another rule on the RCMP. And the RCMP is also the only police service in the 3 territories. And there's been so much put upon the RCMP, so many roles that they fulfill in small communities. And one question, is there increased resources to deal with this? Is there a plan to work with the firearms officers if they are so delegated? And most importantly, are there additional resources to deal with it? Let's start with that.
So with respect to the chief firearms officers and where they're located and resourcing for it and delegation to the RCMP, I will look over my shoulder at my colleague who has far more information on this, but I do not believe there's any increase in RCMP resources for this.
No, there's firearms officers in all the locations, specific locations, but they're managed by.
Why don't you come up? If you don't mind, Chair.
Hi, Kelly Paquette. So there are firearms officers in all of the areas, so they're actually within your regions. You're correct in saying that the CFOs, the chief firearms officers, are located in various provinces. We are actually just reviewing a northern strategy right now, and we are looking at whether we need to have placement of chief firearms officers actually in the territory, so it's perfect timing. We just kicked off this review. We also have a meeting with Senator Anderson as well coming up to just discuss about the services provided, how they're provided, and if we can do things better.
Presumably that would... 1 minute. Yeah. Presumably that would include more resources then, but my concern for all of the panel is that when we try and construct legislation, one size does not fit all in this country. Dawson City does not have the same issue as downtown Toronto. And while as a legislator I eminently sympathetic and empathetic of the concerns and the situation of gun violence throughout the country, the legislation as it's constructed will not work in the north. The issue of firearms officers, the issue of a provincial court judge being available, and the other key issue that's been raised in the Nova Scotia inquiry and elsewhere has been communications between different organizations. And it's critical that the lack and the existence of communications systems in the north be recognized, because again, it's different in all 3 territories. So I would encourage you to examine, when you're discussing this legislation, to examine the problem and the gaps in the legislation where it doesn't meet the needs of northern and rural Canada. Thank you.
We'll leave that advice with our witnesses. We move on now to Senator Youssef, who will be followed by Senator Deakin, Ontario, Cardozo, Dagenet, Couture, and Boisvenu. Senator Youssef.
Thank you, Chair. And again, thank you, all of you, for being here. My question is to do with the banning of handguns. Once the ban legislation is passed and get royal assent, of course, the reality is if someone owns a handgun, and I'll use an example which has been brought to my attention, that person passes away, and he or she has been licensed to have that handgun in a home in safe storage. What happens to that handgun if there's nothing, if they wish to transfer it to a family member? How does that handgun end up in a safe, I guess, transferring, especially in the context where someone may die. What if it's an heirloom in the family? It's been in the family for generations. They want to keep it. How do we adjust for that? Because this is a reality that's come up time and time again in the conversation regarding legislation. So I'm asking you because I think it's seems to be a gap, but maybe you have some resolve and answers that might help me understand this.
I hope so. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator. Just to be clear, the handgun provisions that are in the bill have come into force through regulations right now, so they're already in application. And prior to that, Canada had very strong regulatory framework with handguns. So for somebody who is deceased, they will have some options. First of all, they could render the handgun inoperant and keep it if it has an emotional meaning for the family, for example. They could send it to an authorized business or person who's authorized to own and purchase a handgun. The third element, it could be exported, which is a complex process, so I don't talk about it a lot. But our regulations in the past allows the firearm officers to know exactly who has handguns, and this way there will be a possible tracing of what happens when somebody is deceased, and a follow-up to ensure that either it's rendered to the police or rendered inoperant or sold to a proper industry. So there is really already in place from the past, not only with this bill or the regulations that came into force last year, a very good framework to monitor.
So my follow-up would be, what if the family wants to transfer that to already a licensed family member?
It's not allowed anymore. As of
so
last
the
year.
legislation did not take that into consideration, that you could transfer that to a family member if you chose to
No,
do so.
this is a future, if you wish, like in a few years, Canada's guns, when we did the assessment and the advice, we said about 50 years, if you wish, for sure handguns will be pretty much eliminated. We have around 1.1 million handguns in Canada right now, and in the last 10 years, there was an increase of almost 50% of handguns in Canada. It was a huge increase that we were observing. So no, there will be no transfers, and right now, as it stands, transfers are not allowed anymore.
And there's no recognition that the CFO would have authority to make a decision that they may feel in the public interest in their domain.
Not for the handguns transfers. Obviously, the CFOs, and I believe you'll be talking to our colleagues Terry and Robert later, but the CFOs have discretions on other issues, but to transfer to a family member, that should not happen.
Thank you. Senator Deacon, Ontario.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for continuing with us. Two questions, I hope. The one, my good colleague Senator Plett started off with, and really acknowledgement of the U.S. border, the longest border there is there, and some of the issues around that. I'm wondering, in that thinking, in addition to that thinking, is we've seen and heard that many Canadians don't agree with some of the guns that will be banned as a result of the legislation. Are we worried at this moment, or proactively thinking about how more Canadians will try to illicitly get guns as a result, in anticipation of that, like semi-automatics? I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Happy to provide, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure when the public is referring to semi-automatic guns banned by this bill, because the technical definition that is in front of Senate, I'm not going to go in the past year, there were a lot of iterations, it's prospective. So it is for guns that will be designed after royal assent. So right now, I don't believe this is something that is applicable. So I'm trying to understand the fear to be able to answer your question properly, because other than the handgun freeze that came into force already, no banned guns are included in this bill right now.
And I think therein lies some of the confusion. I think that's part of this. So thank you for addressing that head on, and we'll see where that information, takes us. I think that's part of what's misunderstood, and that's what we're trying to clarify today. So thank you for that. I'm going to carry on with a question that sort of also started earlier around the red flag. So the legislation introduces this new red flag law, which would allow anyone to make an application to a court for an emergency weapons prohibition, order to immediately remove firearms from an individual poses danger to themselves or others. I'm hoping that one of you are able to kind of outline a little bit what that would look like in actual practice in terms of timelines. Would the firearms be removed immediately upon application with 30 days to determine if the removal is actually warranted? What would that look like?
Mr. Chair, I'll start and maybe I'll turn it to my colleague from Justice to clarify any legal details. But let me just clarify for the committee, this is not a new provision. It exists already in the criminal code for law enforcement to be used. It's an expansion as one of the tools that we heard multiple times that it was needed, and that's why we provided this advice to government. So what will happen in this case here is that a victim or a doctor or a neighbor or a friend will have the right to seek from a judge that the red flag be issued, which means that immediate withdrawal of the guns from the individual that law enforcement will have to exercise as soon as possible. And in this provision, there were added clarity to protect if there is a victim who will come forward to protect their identity and ensure that this is not being harmful. Furthermore, there will be the government announced a program to support NGOs, for example, for victims, to provide them with support, because we know some victims will be too exhausted, to be honest, and they don't have the capacity to pursue a legal process. And as well, communication, I don't remember, somebody was talking about communication. It will be important. We are working on a one-stop shop, if you wish, where they could access easily this provision online. But I'll turn it to my colleague from Justice. I don't know if I missed anything from a legal perspective, ma'am.
Well, I mean, just to add, thanks. I mean, it will be as fast as the current process allows for, in the sense that my colleague talked about. There is existing power in the criminal code now for police officers and firearms officers to apply to the court to have guns removed in cases of safety concern. It's expanding, as my colleague has referenced, to include anybody who can make that application. There are two provisions. One is a warrant provision and one is a warrantless provision. So depending on the exigence, the seriousness of the situation, police officers can move quicker without warrant to remove firearms in those more serious instances of safety concern.
Thank you. And I would just finish by saying, because it's not new, then we shouldn't see a glut in the system. The awareness might be different, but we shouldn't see delays or gluts in the system because it's not a new measure.
We'll perhaps come back to that.
I was just trying to slide it in. Thank you very much.
Senator Cardozo, you are next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wonder if I could ask a little bit about the regulations. So once this is passed, there are regulations that you will be developing. Can you give us an idea of which sections of the bill they would be pursuant to, sense of how many, and what's the process you would follow? Would you put out a draft for feedback and then put them and then make them and put them into effect? How long do you think that's going to take?
Thank you very much. Actually, it's happy we're having this question, because there will be some provisions that will come into force through order in council to allow us to do the proper work, either from consultation. For example, I know Senator Anderson was referring earlier about the indigenous, disproportionate impact on indigenous people or the North. So there are provisions in the bill that will not come into force immediately after, at royal assent, and I'll give you an example. Require the revocation of a license for individuals who have been involved in an act of domestic violence. We know that, according to our information, there is a disproportionate impact on men in the North, and we have a duty to consult before the coming into force. So therefore, this provision, for example, will come into force through order in council following the proper, once we have a royal assent, we will do the consultations properly and we'll bring it forward to the government attention. The criminal code amendments that are included, and Matthew, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that the criminal code amendments will come into force at royal assent. So to answer your question, the ones on red flag, the one on increasing minimum penalty to 14 years from 10 years, these are coming into force at royal assent. As per the regulations that we're discussing, this will take the regulatory process, which depending on what kind of consultations, how much feedback we get. And as the minister indicated earlier, I work very closely with my colleagues from Treasury Board Secretariat to ensure that we have a critical path. But it could take up to, in normal circumstances, I'm not saying which ones, but in normal circumstances, we assess about 18 months for a regulation to be officially into force.
And how do you go about that? Do you put out a draft set of regulations and get feedback, or do you ask totally open questions?
Well, depending on the required consultations, we will do the proper consultations, and then there will be a publication in the Government Gazette 1, we call it, because then we will gather more. But for the Firearm Act, I want to just clarify, Firearm Act has a very unique provision for regulations, which requires all regulation to be tabled in both houses for 30 sitting days.
Before they go into effect?
Before it comes back to us with the information to be able to propose a final version of the regulation. And that's very unique, but this is something that the Firearm Act, because of the reality of the Firearm Act, and probably this House have seen multiple of our regulations in the past sitting for 30 sitting days in the Senate and 30 sitting days in the House before we could move forward.
So conceivably, we could give you feedback at that point as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And every regulation amendment to the Firearm Act, unless there are some very strict exemptions, have to go through this process, and we do follow
And
this process.
do you have a sense of how many regulations we're talking about, or put it differently, how many sections of the bill will have regulations?
We do, and I'm happy to provide you actually with the list. I have it in front of me,
That would be
but
very helpful.
I don't
Just
mind
to know.
providing you with the list that from the bill itself, which provisions will be coming into force through ordering council, which ones will be coming into force through immediately at royal assent. So
Yeah.
this gives you a little bit of an idea which legislation we're talking about and which provisions will be.
Yeah, that'd be helpful, because there's so many different
Mr. Chair, we
instruments.
could provide it.
I have one quick
If you would,
question.
we have to move on, I'm afraid. Senator Dagenet is next.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Flynn, I would like to come back to the photos I showed to Minister LeBlanc. He turned towards you at that point in time. So have there been checks done with this shooting club in Kanawaki? Because it looks like they're using weapons that shoot 20 bullets in less than 5 seconds, so you can rent or purchase weapons here. Have you done any checks at this location when it comes to the weapons that are used there? Are they legal?
Chair, through you, to the Senator, I'm not aware if any of the RCMP detachments or if any of the police of jurisdiction have checked those locations to determine the legality of any of the firearms that are being used there, but it's certainly something that we can take offline and look into.
The minister said that he will consult with experts. I would like to have your opinion on that. So now a question to Mr. McCrorie. So police services say that the reserve in Akwesasne is the spot that is used by traffickers to either bring illegal weapons or other substances. And during the Oka crisis, I also had the opportunity of seeing things there. Despite all the police presence, a lot of stuff comes in through there. So I'd like to know what percentage of the additional financial resources are dedicated or are rather used by your services to strengthen this border crossing, and how much sophisticated equipment has been made available to your agents, just to have an understanding of the efforts that have been deployed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
In Ontario, we've actually taken a fairly novel approach when it comes to gun smuggling, and at the risk of being too bureaucratic, we've got 3 different regions in Ontario, but Ontario is a single jurisdiction, and so we've combined the resources in all three regions to have a dedicated task force in Ontario tackle firearms smuggling. And as I've noted, they work very collaboratively with other police of jurisdiction, so it will be the OPP, the Akwesasne Mohawk Police Services, for example, as well as the cross-border element of it. And we're really focused on working with U.S. partners, not only to interdict the arrival here in Canada, but ideally to stop the source as well. And so through forums like the Cross-Border Firearms Task Force, we've formed a really strong working relationship with U.S. colleagues to that very end.
Dernière question, Monsieur le Président, pour Monsieur.
So I have a question for Mr. Dakalbab as well. So when there are references to an act being adopted and then regulation will follow, but to avoid any surprises, maybe regulation should come with the bill as well. So when it comes to web giants or after the adoption of C18, the regulation that was brought forward, we know what happened. So when it comes to the uncertainty and concerns of certain groups, are you aware of these, and why are you not bringing forward regulation as early as today? Well, we would love to do that, but it takes legal authority to develop regulation, so we don't have the choice, but we have to wait for the bill to be adopted into an act for it to receive royal assent. But as I said earlier on, the Firearms Act gives us the responsibility and even the legal obligation of making sure that this is done in 30 days. I'm seeing some people are maybe surprised when they hear this, but I would like to reassure you that as long as we don't have the legal authority, we cannot unfortunately work on the regulations. Thank you, Chair.
Next.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you all. Two questions, one for Mr. Dakalbab and then for Mr. Flynn. I was trying to get some data on the percentage of licensed firearms versus unlicensed firearms used in homicides and suicides from the Library of Parliament. I was sent this answer, quote, Statistics Canada has limited information on the registration status of recovered firearms used in homicides. It's unable to provide a definitive answer on the exact number of homicides committed with registered firearms versus unregistered firearms, and Stats Canada does not have data on the legal registration of firearms used outside of homicides, end quote. Seems to me we have a problem with the granularity of data. We need this data for good policy development. Can you help us understand whether there are any plans to improve this data set and what's being done?
Absolutely. It is a gap that we are aware of. And that's why for the last 2 years, we've been mostly in the last 2 years for a while before, but for the last 2 years, I don't want to steal the thunder of our colleagues from the RCMP. We've been focusing a lot of efforts from a policy perspective on the tracing. Tracing of firearms that are in a crime scene. We're working very closely with the provinces and territories and all law enforcement to ensure that they're seeking the tracing, because usually this is something that the government is pretty good at, doing 100% of the tracing. But all tracing, there has been a significant improvement, and I'll leave it to my colleague from the RCMP to provide you with the data in the last year and a half on the tracing we're doing. This is the only way we will be able to ensure that working with Statistics Canada, and we do have at Public Safety a special program with them to establish these data, but this gap existed. We're working on addressing it and ensuring that we have the proper numbers through proper tracing. But I'll turn it, if you don't mind, to my colleague, Mark Flynn, to give a little bit more data on the improvement that we've been doing.
Yeah, and speaking about tracing, I can give you some statistics. So in 2022, there were approximately 5,000 firearms that were traced. In 2021, 3,200, 2020, 2,000, and then fairly consistent around the 2,000 going back in the time that I have stats here, back to 2018. So you can see an improvement, you can see a concerted effort, and there's ongoing collaboration. As my colleague, Mr. McCrorie from CBSA articulated, there's a lot of collaboration across the border as well with our American friends.
Well, I'm glad to see that that's starting, and I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, that once you get this data, it will be populated with Stats Canada, so we can ask them for that. That's good to know. And thank you, Mr. Flynn, for the tracing issue, because that was my question to you. It was a perfect segue. What proportion of guns that are seized at crime scenes are actually traceable, and why can some guns not be, what, is there an onus on the manufacturer to make the guns straight? Help me understand this conundrum here.
So I will start, and I may need to turn to my colleague if you require more granularity than I'm able to provide. So working from the stats for 2022, there were 5,022 firearms traces done. Of those, 1,888 were successfully traced to the point at which they entered the illegal market.
So that's quite a small number proportionally.
It is 2/3.
Yeah.
We consider it to be a success to start with.
All right.
Then as you look, there are 3,000 that could not be traced to the point at which they entered the illegal market. I'll stop there and I'll turn to my colleague and see, is there additional granularity to those statistics you're able to share? Or is that it?
Serial numbers, right? When you don't have serial.
Right. So as you know, with many firearms, there are not serial numbers, whether they've been removed, ghost guns, etc.
So is there anything manufacturers of guns can be asked to do that makes them more able to be traced? Oops.
We've run out of time. We do have to move on. These are great questions.
But can we get a written response to that?
If we could, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Senator Boisvenu next.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question will be for the Department of Justice. So I'm trying to understand the philosophy around this bill to tighten the rules against organized crime. So on the one hand, the maximum prison terms go up to 14 years. It used to be 10. But over the past 20 years, maximal sentences haven't really been used. But on the other hand, minimum sentences are removed for illegal weapons possession, crimes committed with the use of a firearm, and recently in Quebec, someone who was arrested for drug possession and then firearms possession, they were sent back home to their home. So with this kind of a philosophy, how do you intend to get rid of organized crime? Because there won't be maximum prison terms and there won't be minimum prison terms either. So I'm just trying to understand what type of an impact this philosophy will have on organized crime. Thank you very much for the question. Just to set the background, as the minister said, the bill is just one element of the work that is being done against gangs and organized crime. But of course, there are other problematic realities in Canada when it comes to firearms. I understand, but at the same time, in 2019, there was a bill that was adopted that decriminalized certain elements, and then another bill by which people who have committed firearms offenses are being sent back home. So I'm just trying to understand. I mean, someone who smuggles firearms through the Canadian border or who has illegal possession, there should be minimum prison sentences to send a strong message. Well, I can't really talk about what's in the discretion of judges. It doesn't really have to do anything with the judges. C5, that came from the government. Just to reassure you, I work personally with the provinces and territories and all the police services in Canada on certain programs to, for instance, we have a guns and gangs program that is applicable in Quebec. We received a lot of positive feedback just to make sure that the police is in a better position. No, not C5, the guns and gangs program. I just referred to that. But this bill, or this act rather, had the result of sending people back to their homes. Well, unfortunately, I can't really respond to questions about C5. It already exists. But you just need to be coherent is my point. Thank you, Chair.
Daska next.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you again for being here. I have some questions just for clarification on back to the assault weapons provisions of C21. So we're looking at new assault-style firearms that are to be prohibited. So does that mean that all automatic and semi-automatic style firearms will be prohibited in the future? Is that what it's saying, or am I missing something here? Or is it just semi, I mean, I see the word semi-automatic used. Does that mean that just a certain type of assault-style weapons are going to be prohibited in the future and others will not be prohibited in the future? Is correct?
Happy to walk you very quickly through the criteria that is proposed in the bill. So the bill speaks to firearms that are not handguns.
Yes.
That discharge center fire ammunition in a semi-automatic manner.
Yes.
And was originally designed with a detachable magazine with a capacity of 6 cartridges and more,
Yes.
and designed and manufactured on or after the day of the royal assent. So all these criteria has to
Yes.
be met for the gun in the future to be prohibited in
Okay.
Canada. So it's not all fire.
Okay,
all,
so does that mean that there will be other assault-style weapons still out there to, in a legal situation? Is that what I understand from this?
This definition is, the purpose is to define what in Canada is considered assault-style weapon and is not
okay.
welcome in this society. But
Correct.
every other gun that it does not fit all these criteria will remain subject to the assessment. Either it's going to be restricted, non-restricted, or prohibited, depending on other criteria from other laws. But this one is really the specific criteria, so not all of them for sure.
In terms of what's going to be prohibited?
Exactly.
So when something is prohibited, that means it cannot be owned. You cannot own it.
It cannot enter our market or cannot be even fabricated in Canada. So
Right,
it cannot
can't
be
fabricated,
manufactured
but you
here.
can't own it.
No,
No, you can't own it. Okay, so you can't import it, sell it, or whatever, and you can't possess it.
exactly.
Okay. So I think that clarifies it. Let me ask you, if I have some time, just to go back to the order in council from 2021, where the government prohibited about 1,500 makes and models of assault-style firearms. Now, those 1,500 models, did that include all of the assault-style weapons in the country at that time? Like,
No.
was that a comprehensive ban?
Well, when you use assault, it's just like, I want to be careful with the wording
I
here.
know, it's used as just kind of a descriptor. It's not a legal term, I understand.
There are clear criteria in the order in council from 2020 that were established
Right.
in order to identify which guns are prohibited. And any of these guns that apply, that are part of this criteria were prohibited. At the time, we were talking about 1,500, but not all the guns in Canada. Actually, there are a lot of guns in Canada, still makes and models that are still legal. Last number I saw, like not the exact number, but it was over 19,000 different models that still exist
Yes,
that are
but they're mainly hunting, are they not?
non-restricted,
They're
which
hunting.
could be used,
Yeah.
and some of them are restricted, yes.
Right. So with these 1,500 that were prohibited, is this what the buyback is based on?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Senator Dasco. We're going into what will be a brief second round. Senator Plett and Youssef are on that list so far. If others, Senator Cardozo would like to
Thank
be
you,
added.
Chair. I have two questions, and I'm going to ask the member of CBSA to be fairly succinct so that I can ask the witness from the RCMP a question as well. You talked about guns being seized at the border, and I talked about that. Can you tell me how many of all the guns you seized were actually seized from organized smugglers? I asked a question quite some time ago, an order paper question, and I got an answer that in 2019, about 10% of guns seized at the border were crime guns, and then in 2020, only 2% of all guns seized by CBSA were identified as crime guns. Would those figures be correct? I think that's a fairly low number.
I'll try to be succinct. We've got all the firearms we've seized, so last year about 1,100. About 400 of those were seized at the border, and of the ones seized at the border, I don't have the data readily at hand, but I'd suggest probably 4 to 5% would be what we'd call pre-fashion.
8 of 470, would that be correct?
Pardon me?
8 of 470, would that be correct?
I don't know if it's 8. I don't think it's 8. I think it's a higher number than that, but I don't have that data readily at hand.
Okay, well, the order paper answer was 8 out of 470.
If I may, but the other point being that all the guns that we seized away from the border were typically, I wouldn't say all of them, but a significant proportion of them would have been associated with crime. So there's the two data sets that we have, those at the border and those away from the border.
Well, you made an assumption. For the RCMP, Brian Solvay, the president of the National Police Federation, which represents RCMP officers as well, testified before the House of Commons on this bill. And he stated the bill will not address issues of organized crime nor gang violence, illegal weapon smuggling, systemic causes of crime or emerging threats. Firearms will continue to make their way into Canada. Would you agree with Mr. Solvay? And do you believe that this bill is a wise use of government's time and resources? What does this bill add to the effort of fighting gun crime in Canada, to the resources and tools that the police do not already have?
So I believe this bill will aid in reducing violence.
You disagree with Mr. Solvay?
I think it all comes down to the term address. I don't think that this bill alone will solve the problem. This bill does not speak to solving the root causes of the organized crime violence, the domestic violence, etc. This is a tool for law enforcement to use and for the public when you're looking at the different types of flags that we spoke about already, red flags. This is about providing additional tools to help reduce the harm that comes from firearms that are seen so frequently in domestic violence and in the hands of organized crime and gangs in their violent acts that take place in urban areas. I read some statistics to you earlier that demonstrate how criminals do use some of these firearms in their acts. So I believe that anything that helps reduce firearms that are designed for almost the sole purpose of killing or wounding as many people as quickly as possible absolutely will help public safety and will help police combat those types of activity.
So the law enforcement community, if you will, is definitely divided on this.
I don't believe I would use the word divided. I think there are varying
Well,
opinions.
you wouldn't use the word divided, and you wouldn't use the word address. Mr. Solvay used the word address, and you are disagreeing. That would, to me, mean divided.
So my words were in that the meaning of the word address. The word address to me means in its entirety, okay? I'm saying that this bill will contribute to. It will not solve it in its entirety. When I would use the word address, I take it to mean it will take care of the problem.
Words. We're moving on to the next question from Senator Youssef, followed by Senator Dagenet, and then that will complete our questions for today. So, Senator Youssef.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses. I want to have a question that I think builds on the question my colleague asked earlier in regard to trafficking specifically. If you can give me the average sentence currently for trafficking in illegal firearms and the proposed changes in the legislation in regard to trafficking going forward. Obviously, there's two realities. There's increasing, I think, proposal to bring harsher sentence for those that are trafficking, and there's a current reality of what's the average sentences for those who were convicted of trafficking firearms in the country.
I'll turn it to my colleague Matthew if he has it. If not, we will get back to you. But Matthew?
I do have it. I'll start with the statistics and then just answer the second part of your question. So I can happily provide this as well if you'd like it. In 2021, there were no convictions under 103. 2019, 2020, one conviction resulting in imprisonment of more than 2 years. 2018, sentencing from as low as 3 to 6 months to more than 2 years. So the sentences are what they are. I'd say a couple of things. The point about increasing the maximum penalty does a couple of things. First, it shows Parliament's view that the offenses for which the maximum is increased are deserving of a more stringent criminal justice system response. The Supreme Court, in a decision called Friesen, commented on how increased maximums are a signal that sentencing ranges for those offenses should increase. So the objective here with increasing the maximum penalty is to shift the sentencing range upwards. But of course, fundamentally, any sentence imposed has to be reflective of principles of proportionality, reflect the seriousness of the offense and the responsibility of the offender. On the issue of mandatory minimum penalties, it's absolutely true that a number of those have been repealed. But repealing mandatory minimum penalties does not in any way deviate from the responsibility of the court. The court is still required to impose a sentence that they think is appropriate, reflecting the seriousness of the offense. Nothing changes in that respect.
Thank you. I had omitted to notice Senator Cardozo. So Senator Cardozo, you are next, followed by Senator Dagenet.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. My question is for Acting Commissioner Flynn, and it's regard to the mass casualties and the Mass Casualties Commission in Nova Scotia. To what extent does this bill respond to the Commission's report and to the issues that were raised in that report, directly or indirectly?
So my colleague here says that he is able to succinctly respond to that point.
Thank you very much. I'm leading the coordination efforts of the Government of Canada in collaboration as well with other provinces and territories on the Mass Casualty Commission report. Very, very sad and unfortunate situation. So the technical definition actually does respond directly to recommendation C21, oddly enough. It's the same number in the bill, but in the inquiry report. We are working very closely with each of the recommendations to provide advice to the government eventually. But I could tell you that what we see in this bill, especially the technical definition, is pretty much reflective of what was written in the recommendation of the Mass Casualty Commission report.
Okay. And just quickly, Clause 42 talks about a report to the federal minister. Does that report become public as well? Is that report made public?
Sorry, I'm not sure from the mass casualty.
No, sorry, not mass casualties. I'm coming back to the
okay, sorry.
The bill here.
I'm not privy to this clause. Fortunately, we could look at it and get back to you, but I don't know if my colleagues from Justice.
Well, the Commission of Firearms is required on a yearly basis to provide a report to the federal minister.
It'll be in the
yeah. Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure which one you were referring to. Yes, this one will be part of the report that the commissioner will be providing. So if your question is it going to be public, then they will make sure that it is public, yes.
Is that in the act, or are you just giving us that verbal community?
No, it's in there.
Yes, no, sorry, like you're referring to the clause?
Yeah.
The clause says this has to be available information and will be public. Like that's a guarantee. It's not RCMP discretion.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Our final question for the panel goes to Senator Dagenet.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ma question.
Thank you, Chair. My question will be for Mr. Flynn. Mr. Flynn, there has been some confusion recently on identifying assault-style weapons, which will be prohibited. Can you give us an idea as to the number of people who are affected by this ongoing work over the past couple of years at the RCMP? And given the recruitment difficulties you are having, do you have the sufficient number of people who are well equipped well enough to do this analysis on the existing weapons and the new weapons that might become available on the marketplace? How does this department at the RCMP function? Thank you for the question.
The RCMP has invested a lot of time and effort in training both internal to the RCMP as well as across our law enforcement community to ensure that all the police officers, as they're doing their daily work, are well informed of the various elements of this legislation and in firearms enforcement in general. With respect to resources, I don't have the exact numbers. I'm not sure if my colleague does or not, but we can commit to providing you any numbers as far as what the RCMP has in its firearms program after. But like any type of public safety initiative and anything that's done to help contribute and give law enforcement new tools, it has a cost and a benefit effect to it. So even though there are additional resources being applied to a problem, much of it through funded positions, there's also a positive impact on our day-to-day operations through the reduction in the violence and the reduction in the access to such firearms.
Est-ce qu'il vous arrive de...
Do you also help out the local police at Akwesasne, for instance? They're well organized these days, but this is an area that's very difficult to do surveillance with the river and the terrain. It's hard to intercept vessels at night, but are there calls on the RCMP to come in and assist the local police in Akwesasne? I think there was a vessel that was added, but can you talk to us about what sort of assistance has been offered to them?
The Akwesasne Mohawk police are a very capable police force, and the RCMP does work extremely closely with them and actually has an embedded member of the RCMP with them in many of their operations and with their police force. We have our Cornwall detachment is in that area of operation, and as I stated, they work extremely closely with them as well as the U.S. counterparts.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Deschanel, and thank you to our panel. Colleagues, this brings us to the end of this panel, and I would like to start by thanking Mr. Dakalbab, Mr. Taylor, Mr. Flynn, Mr. McCrorie, and Ms. Paquette for the time that you've dedicated to be with us today. You've helped us considerably with this study, and you have provided good answers to the questions today. Beyond this, we thank you for everything else you do in your very important jobs and lives, and the contributions that makes to Canadians across the country. And on behalf of the committee and the Senate, thank you very much for the work that you do outside of this room. It's hugely important and it's hugely appreciated. Thank you very much. And colleagues, we will now suspend for a quick health break and reconvene for our next panel at 6:20. Continue with our next panel. For those tuning into today's meeting, it explores Bill C21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments respecting firearms. For this next hour, we have the pleasure of welcoming from Alberta's Chief Firearms Office, Dr. Terry Bryant, Chief Firearms Officer, and from the Saskatchewan Firearms Secretariat, Robert Freeberg, Commissioner and Chief Firearms Officer. Thank you, Dr. Bryant and Mr. Freeberg, for joining us today. I invite you to present your opening remarks, to be followed by questions from our members, and I remind you that you each have 5 minutes for your testimony. We will begin with Dr. Bryant whenever you're ready.
Thank you for inviting me to appear today. Bill C-21 is misguided. Its burden falls overwhelmingly on already heavily regulated law-abiding firearms owners, and it is premised on the prohibition of specific types of firearms, a failed approach to reducing violence. If this bill cannot be abandoned, it requires, at a minimum, significant amendment. All Canadians should oppose this bill in its current form, whether they own or even like firearms. Those most directly affected by this bill are, of course, law-abiding firearms owners. This bill will effectively put an end to many long-established, safe, internationally recognized target shooting sports by cutting off the flow of new entrants.
Dr. Bryant, could you just slow down a little bit to assist with our interpretation?
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
Well, I'm passionate about these topics and I get excited and I want to go fast. Even those sports that use single shot, muzzle loading, black powder, flintlock pistols, a Pirates of the Caribbean era technology over 200 years old, will die away. This loss will have no conceivable public safety benefit. For many individuals and communities, these sports are an important part of their heritage. They also serve to socialize new firearms owners into the safe and responsible use of firearms as a group activity. If we allow this bill to shrink the pool of handgun owners, membership in shooting ranges will shrink, putting their economic viability at risk. Hunters and others who rely on these ranges to practice will be left without a safe place to shoot. Firearms businesses and the many thousands of hardworking Canadians they employ will also be gravely affected. The handgun transfer freeze, combined with the order in Council of May 2020, have eroded much of the market that sustains these mostly small, family-owned businesses. Many are barely hanging on, and some have already been forced to close. Canadians concerned about protecting citizens from injustice should be gravely concerned. Even if ultimately found innocent after an accusation that results in revocation of their handgun registrations, the prohibition on the issuance of new handgun registration certificates will prevent individuals from recovering their previous privileges. If there are flaws in Canada's procedures for removing firearms from those who should not have them, these flaws are not in a lack of powers for CFOs to do so, but in the resources most CFOs have available to apply these powers. Canadians concerned with property rights should be gravely concerned by the hundreds of millions of dollars of lawfully acquired property that has been rendered effectively unsaleable at any reasonable price. Already, thousands of handguns worth many millions of dollars are stuck in estates, prevented from finding willing buyers by the regulatory freeze on handgun transfers. Many historic artifacts and cherished family heirlooms may end up being needlessly destroyed. Because the precipitous imposition of the handgun transfer freeze overwhelmed the transfer processing system in the months between the announcement and the imposition of the freeze, many who wanted to sell their handguns as an estate planning measure were unable to do so. These financial consequences are manifestly unjust. Canadians concerned about public safety should be gravely concerned because this measure will do nothing to enhance public safety and will undermine it in ways large and small. Many individuals whose acquisition of a handgun could enhance public safety will be prevented from acquiring the equipment they need, such as instructors teaching the Canadian Restricted Firearms Safety course. Many smaller police forces and security companies will find the ranges where they practice will close. Our firearms control system is already riddled with inconsistencies and really needs to be redesigned from scratch. Yet C21 would further worsen this confusion by defining prohibited long guns based on date of manufacture rather than any proven objective criteria. It will also centralize life and death decisions on authorizations to carry in the Commissioner of Firearms, an official far too removed from the field to make timely, informed decisions. These measures will undermine confidence in our firearms control system at precisely the time when everyone's efforts should be focused on strengthening societal confidence in our institutions. For all these reasons, and many more, I hope that the Honourable Senators will initiate a thorough review of this deeply flawed legislation and abandon it, or at least amend it significantly to strengthen public safety, allow legitimate shooting sports to continue, and depoliticize this issue so we can all return to the hard daily work of ensuring maximum public safety. I and my staff stand ready to assist with more detailed support in this effort to ensure that what emerges from your process of sober second thought is a bill that all Canadians deserve, one that protects public safety in a measured and balanced way. Maintenant, je serai ravi de répondre à vos questions.
Now I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you much, Dr. Bryant. Over now to Mr. Freeberg, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Honourable Senators, thank you for the invitation to appear before this committee as it studies Bill C21. Given the complexity of firearms legislation and regulations, I've also brought with me Blaine Bevan, our senior legal team from Saskatchewan, who can provide me some guidance when we get into questions because of the complexity of the legislation. The Saskatchewan Firearms Office mandate is to promote firearms safety and ensure that Saskatchewan firearms community has a strong voice on these important issues. The office has jurisdiction over the licensing, storing, transportation, carrying, and use of firearms in the province. The office also focuses on intensive public education and community outreach to citizens about safe firearm use, storage, and transportation. We have now expanded from our original mandate to include the establishment and operation of the new provincial ballistics lab to provide a timely testing system for law enforcement to conduct and also conduct prosecutions of offences under the Saskatchewan Firearms Act and manage the Provincial Firearms Compensation Committee. The Government of Saskatchewan strictly enforces the Federal Firearms Act and holds accountable those that do not comply. Revocations and refusals of firearms licenses in the provinces have increased threefold since Saskatchewan assumed administration of the Federal Firearms Act in September of 2021. However, the Government of Canada has yet to compensate the province at all for any of the costs of approximately $5 million to date. All the costs incurred in the administration of the Federal Firearms Program currently. The province, however, does budget upwards of $8 million per year now that we've taken over and we're now the Saskatchewan Firearms Office to administer the Federal Firearms Act, oversee the Provincial Ballistics Lab, prosecute offences, and advocate on behalf of licensed firearms owners. In Saskatchewan, a significant proportion of firearms used in criminal activity are illegally acquired firearms. For example, firearms may be stolen and used to commit further crimes, but generally these are not handguns or restricted or prohibited firearms. Rather, they are predominantly non-restricted or firearms that have been modified or home-built. Legal firearm owners have an important role to play, of course, in enhancing public safety, which is why Saskatchewan is focusing a great deal of effort on public education to ensure safe storage, licensing, and use of firearms. Properly storing firearms can prevent firearms of any kind from getting into the wrong hands and enhance public safety greatly. Banning and seizing firearms is not the solution. This fact has been overwhelmingly proven over and over again in many studies and in other countries who have taken similar action as our current federal government is looking at. Comparing Canada to the United States statistically is not appropriate, as they do not have the very regimented laws that currently exist in Canada regarding licensing, mandatory training, safe storage, and effective regulatory frameworks. Generally, as a rule, CFOs across Canada have had little or no consultation whatsoever on firearms legislation and need to be directly involved as the frontline regulators enforcing these regulations. And I should say enforcing, but providing the regulatory framework. Unfortunately, the announcement of this proposed legislation and subsequent OACs has actually dramatically increased inquiries from our stakeholders and therefore actually negatively impacted our agency's ability to perform our primary duties and related public safety investigations with absolutely no financial resources or otherwise being provided by the federal government or any other provincial CFO agency. This legislation expects and trusts law-abiding firearms owners to voluntarily turn their handguns for destruction without compensation, potentially after multiple decades of safe and legal ownership, storage, and use. Ironically, this legislation does not trust those same owners now to engage in the commerce of purchasing and selling handguns between each other. While Bill C21 has been studied by the House of Commons, it was made clear that there was no intention to provide compensation for the destruction of handguns. In Saskatchewan, however, the Saskatchewan Firearms Act, which has been recently passed, mandates that where the federal government seeks to expropriate handguns or any other firearms, which includes the ones in Bill C21, and renders them of no value, that the fair market price must be paid by the federal government prior to their destruction. Police agencies should not be in the business of seizing firearms from law-abiding firearms owners, but dealing exclusively with those individuals or criminal organizations who use firearms illegally. Police resources across Canada are so limited as it is, and such seizures should not be their priority. Bill C21, if passed, would enact a slow ban on handguns and would codify the current prohibition that was regulated without notice in October of 2022, which prohibits the transfer of handguns between licensed individuals in most circumstances. As a result, handgun owners will have almost no other financial opportunities to recover their investment. An option currently legally available to those owners is to simply sell the component parts of the firearm, that is, the components that do not contain the registration or serial number of the firearm, which can easily be sold to another licensed individual or business. In some cases, it's been reported that the individual components being stripped are actually potentially fetching a higher price than assembled firearms. Mr. Chair, I believe that to better safeguard firearms transfers and ownership, the chief firearms officers in each province should be permitted to transfer existing registration certificates for handguns between licensed owners. This would maintain the overall value of firearms and serve to reduce the potential of parting out or existing handguns for compensation that frankly could be possibly diverted into legal 3D manufactured firearms. Further, this would potentially mitigate the risk of handguns from estates being diverted to an unlicensed individual, as they are not easily traced once the owner is deceased. By the time that law enforcement or the Canadian Firearms Program or our CFO offices become aware of this occurring, it can take up to 5 years of time for that have actually passed when the person's license expires. Because we only find out then that the person's been deceased when they're come up for renewal. As the law presently stands, individuals who possess firearms through the operation of an estate do not actually need a firearms license to dispose of the firearm, but do require the authorization that they must seek out with limited options to realize the value of an estate asset. There is a risk for illegal sales of firearms. Licensed firearms owners simply are not the problem and represent a minimal risk to themselves and others. The sports they compete in are highly regulated, including the purchase, sale, transportation, use, and storage of these firearms. The shooting ranges they're using for target practice are approved by the CFO under the Canadian Firearms Program. These same facilities are shared by law enforcement daily and will certainly cease to be in existence if the Recreational Firearms Committee is no longer able to support them through membership and usage fees. This will have a very negative impact on law enforcement agencies across Canada who heavily rely on these for training. To conclude, Mr. Chair, Saskatchewan is always supportive of gun control legislation that continues to improve public safety. Any proposed legislation must balance the privileges currently provided to responsible law-abiding firearms owners with strict enforcement and accountability for those that commit violent criminal offenses involving firearms. Significant studies should be undertaken on Bill C21 to determine if it's legislation if it's appropriate to be even passed, and to determine if the potential cost is appropriate compared to minimal deliveries on public safety. There is also the increased workload of police services in dealing with surrendered handguns with minimal resources that they already have. The Saskatchewan Firearms Office and our team is prepared to assist in any way possible with the study of Bill C21. And I must tell you, I'm very committed to public safety, and I'm very proud of what our firearms officers do every day alongside law enforcement to make Saskatchewan a safer place. We've also partnered with many Indigenous communities to develop safety programs where we're embedding firearms officers in their communities to help increase licensing and compliance. So we're very proud of what we're doing in Saskatchewan. And thank you so much for the opportunity to share that with you today.
Thank you, Mr. Freeberger. We will now proceed to questions. We have an hour to move through this session, and in order to ensure that each member is able to participate fully, we're going to stay with 4 minutes for the questions and answers. It would help if you keep your questions succinct and identify the person you're addressing the question to. The first question goes to our Deputy Chair, Senator Dagenet, and also on the list currently are Senators O'Platt, Deakin, Ontario, Arnott, Boisvenu, and Duncan. Over to you, Senator Dagenet.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses. I have a question to Dr. Bryant. Dr. Bryant, you established the potential harms of C21 on sports shooting, but would like to hear you on other aspects of this bill as well. Do you have statistics from your province that would show us to what proportion the crimes committed in Alberta are done with illegal weapons, illegal firearms, so firearms that have never been registered? And also, Bill C21, would it potentially constitute an advantage or a tool to fight against organized crime? Of course, they're not using legal firearms in the first place. Or do you think it will dissuade members of organized crime? Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I don't think we have good statistics in Canada to come up with a specific answer to your question about the proportion of firearms that come from domestic or foreign origins. But this is a very important question. And as our office was set up, we established a unit for data analysis. And we will soon have a statistics specialist who will be able to answer such questions. But I think so far this might have been the biggest problem in terms of coming up with good policy concerning firearms. Thank you. My second question will be for Mr. Freeberg. Mr. Freeberg, on the political and social front, what I'd like to know is the following. How is Bill C21 seen by hunters and sports shooters in Saskatchewan? And you mentioned handguns that are registered by sports shooters in full compliance of the law. So apart from the athletes who will have special rights, we're being told by the minister, what will happen those who are involved in sports shooting without necessarily taking part in competitions?
It faded a little bit at the end, the last part of your question, so I'll do my best to answer. So in Saskatchewan, we have 115,000 licensed PAL, normal, I call non-restricted firearms holders, license holders. And we have about 65,000 of those that have RPALs, so they have the ability to purchase handguns that are used, for sport shooting, because that's their primary purpose. We can't use them for hunting and other purposes under provincial hunting regulations and federal legislation. So, but the feedback that we're getting, we attend all, for the most part, as the CFO Bryant, we go to the gun shows and speak with the stakeholders, and there's no support for this. And the main reason for it is that many of the firearms that are categorized in there, there's been a lot of focus put on the AR-15. In Saskatchewan, we have about 1,200 AR-15s that exist that are registered in the province. They're a registered firearm. And they have not been used in any kind of a criminal manner. We haven't had one single case where the AR-15 has been utilized. And I'm not even aware that there's that many in Canada across the board, other than the one that the tragedy in Nova Scotia, I believe, which was illegally acquired and smuggled from the U.S. But as from registered owners, it's non-existent. The handgun shooters, for the most part, the only place they can discharge a handgun is on a licensed range. So they all buy memberships in their local clubs. They support their local wildlife federations, who buy habitat land, they build trout ponds, they mentor youth on hunter safety programs, all types of safety programs, and they also deliver safety courses. And with the handguns going away, a lot of the new people coming into the sport are purchasing handguns and getting the training. So by taking that away, we've also lost the ability to maintain instructors. So those same instructors teach the regular PAL course as well. And frankly, I mean, we're losing instructors at a very fast pace because some of our older instructors are leaving and we can't get new ones to come in. And they can't even instruct the handgun course because they can't even buy handguns to even use and deactivate for the purposes of training. So it's devastating across the province. Also, ADM Dakalbab was saying that, well, we're not affecting hunters or ranchers with these firearms. The Mini 14, for example, which is one of the firearms that's restricted, and it was used, terrible, terrible tragedy in Quebec and other places, but that firearm is very predominant in Saskatchewan for hunting coyotes. It's also very, in a different variation, is very common in Indigenous communities, as is the SKS rifle that was originally on the list that came off because there wasn't consultation done, and they're a very popular firearm in Indigenous communities. But again, they do have a bad reputation because there has been tragedies committed with them. The whole purpose is to make sure that the people holding them are licensed, that we've got some governance over them, and that they're being trained, and that they're being responsible with locking up their firearms. And so since I've started with the government of Saskatchewan, we've put an immense effort into that. And I think we're one of the few provinces that have actually in the process of moving a MOU forward with Indigenous partners to actually get the licensing up. Because we have communities in the north, we have 1,600 people in a community with 12 licensed individuals. Well, there's a lot more sustenance hunting going up there than 12 people are not feeding 1,600 people in their community. But we need to go and work with them to get a solution.
Mr. Freeberg, thank you. I've allowed this to go over time because it's a question on the minds of many of our members around the table. So thanks very much. Thank you. We go to Senator O next, followed by Senator Platt.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here. My question is for both of you. As you will know, under the red flag provision of this bill, anyone can go to the court and ask a judge to seize the gun or suspend the license of a person who owns a gun if they believe that they pose a threat to anyone else or themselves. But the criminal justice section of the Canadian Bar Association has said the following: the current law contains sufficient powers to accomplish the goal of seizing weapons believed to have been used in a crime or removing them from the hands of a person who are believed to be a danger to themselves or others. This provision will impact the fire officers across the country. What consultations did the federal officers have with each of your office in relation to this provision before the bill was introduced?
Well, I can answer that very quickly and save us time. No consultation whatsoever.
There you go. There you go.
And I'll save some time too for my longer-winded discussion. It was zero. And you're very correct in that the 117 public safety orders can be used by the police, or the CFOs have the authority to do that. The issue is having the people there, and Mr. Bevan has been in our office. We have 2 lawyers that actually, we reach out to law enforcement partners to promote the fact that they should be utilizing these 117 tools and so forth. Because many times they'll go to a home where there's domestic violence. They're not even looking for the PAL. They're not even talking about firearms. Then we see the FIP or the charge on there and find out that this person has a lot of firearms, and we're actually having the police go back in there to seize firearms or take the PAL, well, because we're now prohibiting the individual from having a firearm. So you can bring in this legislation, but as I indicated earlier, you need to have the funding in place and the mechanism in place to make sure that our frontline officers and the firearms officers have the ability to go out and take these firearms. I mean, when we took over in Saskatchewan, we had people we had files that were 800 days old that hadn't been looked at. We had files where they were sending out a letter to the gun owner saying you can't have your gun anymore. Well, he's not in compliance with the law anyway. He's probably not even checking his mailbox, and then 30 days later you go and say, well, where's the gun? I don't know, I gave it to somebody. So we need to do more to make sure whatever laws we have in place, whether it's these new ones in C21 or the existing ones that we had before, that we're actually using the tools and that we're providing the support to the firearms offices across Canada and the law enforcement partners to get the firearms away from the people that shouldn't have the firearms, so we don't see these tragedies.
Thank you very much, Senator Platt. Very quickly, about 45 seconds.
So if this bill passed, do you believe that the gun club business will went straight down and a lot of instructors will be losing their jobs?
I don't believe it. It's happening already, Senator. I mean, we're losing a club that I was president of before I took this job had 3,000 members. They're down to 2,000 members. Their primary supporters were handgun sport shooters. And that was a family activity. It's not, there's, husbands, wives, kids, lots of people out there participating. And I can understand when people look at the violence in the streets of Toronto, but it's not the same situation in Saskatchewan or Alberta where it's target shooting or it's sport shooting. And I want to just mention that, it was, well, we're out of time.
Right out of time.
Thank you.
Senator Platt.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I'm not a gun owner. I used to be a gun owner. And 30 years ago, there was another Liberal government that passed a bill called C68, which imposed a long gun registry, and many of us remember that. That initiative was a complete and colossal failure and wasted about $2 billion on a long gun registry, which ultimately had to be repealed because it had no support from firearms owners. I, at that time, gave my guns away because I didn't want to bother with it. And I wasn't really a hunter. I was a bit of a sport shooter, and so I gave them away. But that's not my question. My question to both of you is a very similar question. Dr. Bryant, Alberta government has introduced Bill 8, which allows the Alberta government to establish regulations to prevent municipalities and municipal police services from cooperating with the federal government on any measures that negatively impact firearms owners. Saskatchewan has enacted the Saskatchewan Firearms Act, which, among other things, establishes licensing requirements for seizure agents involved in possible firearms expropriations. It is a clear response to the federal government's arbitrary gun ban of 2020. So my question to both of you is, I would like your perspective on the impact of such provincial legislation on the offices like both of yours, which are then put between potentially contradictory federal and provincial legislation. And how do you see this playing out in the years ahead? Dr. Bryant, maybe, and then Mr. Freeberg. Thank you.
Thank you. So you're very right that the Alberta government has taken legislative action to protect the interests of firearms owners and public safety. The point of this legislation is not to block the federal government in the legitimate exercise of its discretion in its areas of jurisdiction. The point of this legislation is that many of the ideas that they were putting forward could actually have negatively affected public safety. And so our legislation is intended to ensure that whatever the federal government does, and we will oppose their ideas in the court of public discussion, but if they actually do proceed to do something like this, then we will make sure, A, that their actions do not pose a risk to the Alberta society at large. So, for example, if they are going to have some kind of procedure to confiscate guns, a measure which we do not support, if they insist on doing that, then we will make sure that it is done in a fashion that doesn't expose the Alberta public to unnecessary risk. And we will also make sure that any compensation is full and adequate and prompt, so that if these unfortunate measures are pushed through, that we will protect the interests both of the society at large in Alberta and of firearms owners in particular with respect to compensation.
Thank you, Dr. Bryant. Mr. Freeberg.
Yes, and I won't repeat a lot of what Dr. Bryan has indicated, because Saskatchewan has a similar approach. I mean, when this whole thing came out with the OAC initially, and now the handgun slow ban, there really hasn't been a strong plan put together on the actual confiscation process. I mean, we've seen from situations, well, we'll just take them down, people take them to the post office and ship them back somewhere. Well, our post offices are in rural Saskatchewan or a hardware store, and it's certainly not secure to leave a bunch of firearms there. Second side is, well, the compensation. We've looked at the initial offers of compensation, and they're woefully inadequate. And then there's also all the accessories that people bought for these firearms that have no value, so that we feel that should be taken into account. And then the third side of it is, we don't believe that firearms, and I've heard the use at this Senate hearing all the time of weapons. I'm sorry, we call them firearms. They're weapons when they're used criminally. They're not weapons until they're used in a criminal manner. But when these firearms are supposedly such a high risk to public safety, well, then we shouldn't be just chopping them up until we've done a ballistic test on them, which is one of the reasons why Saskatchewan has gone and built, and in the process of building its own provincial ballistics lab. Because currently police forces take up to 18 months to get a firearm that's used in a crime even analyzed. But we feel it's important before we destroy the firearm to make sure that we take a digital signature of it in case it was used in a crime, because a criminal could turn it in, get paid money for it, and then turn around and we chop it up for him. I mean, what a great system. So we just wanted to put some control in there. So we're not there to block the federal government. We're there just to make sure that it gets done properly and that we're doing it in a manner that makes good business sense.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Won't be a second round, but if there is.
So, we have 7 senators on the list: Senator Deakin, Ontario, Senators Arnott, Boisvenu, Duncan, Beam, Youssef and Kuchar. So we will have to be very disciplined colleagues. Senator Deacon, Ontario.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the three of you for being here today. I'd like to build on the question of my colleague about that clause 43 that would allow you as chief firearm officers, to both of you, to provide exemptions for the handgun ban if an individual trains, competes, or coaches in a handgun shooting discipline that is on the program of the International Paralympic Committee or Olympic Committee with some other conditions included. You said that this has already basically been in effect since October of last year with the regulations brought in. How have you, in both of your worlds, honestly, how have you navigated this, and have people been applying with you from their sport? Have your offices had the capacity to handle the applications?
Well, we have received, I'm not sure that one can actually say an application. In at least one case there is, because there isn't really a procedure established for this yet. So we have a number of people that we have tried to push through their applications, and we have not been successful in accomplishing it even once. I'm unaware of anyone anywhere who has. And these are the cases that meet the very demanding and narrow criteria in the bill, because when you talk about disciplines that are on the program of the International Olympic or Paralympic Committee, this is a tiny portion of even handgun shooting. This is maybe 1% of handgun shooting, and it appears not even that is actually being allowed. And what I think the solution really needs to be, and I'm quite sure that we would find the resources to do this because our provincial government is supportive of the firearms community, would be to give CFOs greater discretion to designate which kind of organizations could issue those kind of letters. Ideally, we wouldn't need that, but if we are going to move to a more regimented procedure, I don't think it should be one that gives the false image that no one is being affected because they've allowed for this, when even if it were allowed, it's only maybe 1% of the handgun target shooting, and in practice, so far at least, not even that.
And what's your denial? What's coming to you? What is the letter, correspondence? What's the denial?
We don't even get that far. Like we put these things in and say, well, we need to do this, and there's no response.
And we've had exactly the same. I won't repeat it all, but we've sent in the same exemption requests to the registrar to allow people to have firearms specifically for Olympic target shooting. And we have not been able to get any paperwork pushed through. And we've even had our lawyer, Mr. Bevan, have sent formal letters, but they refuse to send a refusal, because then the individual can go and file an application and to court to have it overturned. So we're not getting any paperwork. It's just getting sat on. And again, the point that Dr. Bryant was raising is very valid, is that I was an Olympic target shooter, but I didn't start there. I started in another sport shooting, and then I developed some skills, and they said, hey, you've got an ability to do this. And I slowly started to move up into shooting the Olympic sports. And then eventually, as my age rise went, I went off and to shoot other sports because, I wasn't able to compete in the Olympic rim anymore, but at least I had another place to go to enjoy my sport, and that's gone away. There's no way to feed into the Olympic system, and there's no way right now for us currently through the regulations. They're just refusing to pass an application.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Arnott is next.
Thank you. I'm going to be very succinct here because there's some big issues that I want to point out to my colleague senators through your witness testimony here. I believe, Mr. Freeberg, that the model that you've implemented in Saskatchewan, your interpretation of your mandate, is a model for all of Canada, with the pragmatic things you've done, with the education that you're working on, and all of the stakeholders, farmers, ranchers, sport shooters, hunters, trappers, and the First Nations and the Métis people. You've gone out and you've made those relationships work, and you're producing good results. My question is this. Do you believe that this one-size-fits-all approach that's incorporated in this act is appropriate? Or do you believe that it would be wise for this legislation to give discretion to the chief firearms officers in each province and territory after consultation with stakeholders in the province and certainly the municipalities, both urban and rural, on how firearms should be managed in the province in that jurisdiction and how this act will be enforced in that jurisdiction? The second component of my question is this. The government of Saskatchewan has given you a mandate of $8 million to do that. That's about $7 per capita. That's a lot of money in Saskatchewan. But you've got a robust plan. It's about safety, enforcement, and education. And you're working with stakeholders to ensure public safety and responsible firearms ownership. We all know that the strength of any law is directly proportional to the consistency and quality of the enforcement. What kind of monies have been talked about by the federal government to the provincial government, how they're going to come up with the monies required to actually be successful and have enforcement in a real way, given what you've done in Saskatchewan with $8 million? That, to me, it's all about enforcement. It's no use having this act if it's not going to be enforced in a fair and appropriate manner. And that can't happen unless there's a lot of resources, nothing like what they've offered you in the past. I mean the federal government.
Well, I want to answer your last question first, if you will permit me, Mr. Chair. And it's an excellent question, Senator, and thank you so much for your compliments. We're very proud of what we've done, and we are leading the country, I think. The point that I want to talk about on the funding is our colleagues that were here earlier from the RCMP and so forth were talking about tracing and all the rest of those things. Saskatchewan never had a provincial firearms lab. The province is paying for it. We've waited 6 months for the RCMP just to get the internet connection hooked up, which we still don't have. We're waiting for the MOU from the RCMP that signs that allows us to trace the brass that's going into the center. So I take objection to the fact that there's, I'm sure people are trying, but at the end of the day, we've got a provincial government that's willing to build a provincial lab to trace firearms, and we're not getting the support. So we're not even asking for money. We're asking just for someone to turn on an internet connection and sign an MOU. So those are the type of frustrations that we see. So to your question about the financing side of it, I mean, we've been in negotiations since I took over the program in August of 2020 is when I started building it. I was appointed as the CFO by the government in 2021. We've been negotiating the contribution agreement with the federal government, and it started at $1.2 million. It eventually got bumped up to $1.5 million, and we're still negotiating, and we still haven't got a contract, and we've been sending bills to them totaling $2.5 million a year. Then they say, give us a business case. Well, there's the actual costs. I mean, that's the best business case you can ever have. So I don't know how any other CFO across Canada is going to be able to negotiate a fair and equitable arrangement. I mean, they're at the mercy of what they're being offered. There's no negotiation. So to your point, is there anything in C21 that addresses that? No. Has there been any money put forth under these programs? No. There has been work done in guns and gangs and some other initiatives. But what I'm trying to get across to the Senate today is that we need to do more on the front end. I mean, it's sure we have the kids with the issues and guns and violence, but we need to do the storage. I mean, these firearms are quoted about 69% firearms. Those aren't handguns. If you start drilling down on those numbers, you're going to find out they're rifles and shotguns that aren't being stored properly. We need to fix that problem, and that's what we're focusing on in Saskatchewan, and we've been extremely successful in doing so.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Freeberg. We go now to Senator Boisvenu, followed by Senators Beam, Youssef, and Kuchar. Senator Boisvenu.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Bryant, I'd like to congratulate you for your perfect French, first off. My question has to do with an announcement or what you said in terms of your concerns about control of firearms in the future. And you said Bill C21 continues to undermine confidence in our system of firearms control, all the while not reducing the abusive and violent use of firearms. Can you please explain to us what your reasoning was when you said that? I think in all matters, not just firearms, you have to have the public's confidence. and especially those who are impacted by an act or by a regulation. When this confidence is undermined or threatened, you end up losing that relationship, which is absolutely necessary not only to abide by the law, but also to go beyond what's in the act. For instance, when it comes to storing guns, we shouldn't simply have security measures that simply satisfy the requirement in the act. You have to go above and beyond. And that is only possible if there is a relationship of confidence between the authorities and the public at large. And these measures undermine that confidence. That is why I think it undermines public safety as well. Because without this confidence, without the trust, you will not have public safety.
I omitted to mention Senator Duncan, so Senator Duncan is next, followed by Senators Beam, Youssef and Kuchar.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the witnesses that are here today. My question is very direct for Dr. Bryant. Are you the CFO for the Northwest Territories?
No.
Do you know who is?
Yes.
Can you tell me that?
Yes. So the Alberta office, I understand your confusion. The office used to be, the Alberta office used to be responsible for the Northwest Territories. When we converted from being a federal office to a provincial office, of course, a provincial office couldn't manage a federal territory. So the headquarters of the federal office for the Northwest Territories is actually in the same building where we are, just a different floor. And the previous Chief Firearms Officer for the combined territories of Alberta and Northwest Territories is now the CFO for the Northwest Territories, Jennifer Hart-McDonald. And I'd be happy to provide you with contact information for her.
Thank you very much, and I'll direct a written question to her. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Beam.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both our witnesses for being here and listening to the questions being posed by my colleagues. I'm wondering whether you have any commentary on some of the jurisdictional issues. By that I mean, is there a good data sharing relationship between you as CFOs, between each other? Is that even required? Is it there with the federal government as well? Is there a trend line that you might want to comment on? And in particular, the laws that are out there, and this one, if it is passed, even if amended, where would that fit in terms of any data sharing and jurisdictional consultation? You mentioned earlier that there was no consultation on this bill, so that's what has prompted me to ask about the other areas.
So when we talk about data sharing, I would say, so we're actually required, mandated by law, to report on many of the things, how many of these authorizations or these licenses we issue and so on. There are a couple of areas where there are gaps there, but they're very small, very minor parts of our activities. So essentially, we report everything to the federal government. And then there's at least a subset of those statistics that are reported in the report of the Commissioner of Firearms, which comes out every year. And there are tables in there that will, for example, provide a number of revocations by province and that sort of thing. We do not, so the information sharing is largely from us up. There's very little that comes the other way. I would also say that we do have opportunities to share experiences. So CFO Freeberg and I knew each other before we became CFOs. We probably talk every week informally about different issues. One of the things that is a very important part of what I do, I work 7 days a week, virtually every week. I work 5 days a week in the office, and I spend virtually every weekend doing outreach. I attend gun shows, I attend shooting competitions, I reach all kinds of other organizations. Also during the week, I often address, for example, annual general meetings of fish and game clubs and things like that. So we have a very extensive outreach program. So it's not only our colleagues in Saskatchewan, but we share many of the same philosophies. And so we exchange that opportunities.
With other CFOs? I mean,
Yes,
you're
I'm coming,
adjacent now
I'm
and
just about to,
provinces.
that was my very next point.
Okay, thank you.
That twice a year, we have conferences. So I will actually be back in Ottawa November, I think, 20th to 22nd, around then. And we meet with all of the other CFOs. We also consult on issues of importance that are of a more urgent nature. We'll just send out an email and, you know, we've had this problem. Do you have the same thing? How are you addressing it? So there is an exchange of experience. So it's not specifically data, but it is sharing our experiences.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Beam, over to Senator Youssef.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for being here, and equally thank you for the work you do. You're on the front lines, obviously, and I don't pretend to understand the complicatedness and the responsibility of trying to get, of course, folks to deal with the safety issue in storing, but also recognizing that the outreach to reach communities that are not necessarily in urban areas is not an easy one in the broader context. This bill, of course, have not just the issue of handgun, but it talks about other things, and I guess I'm going to be very specific. On the question of ghost guns, which is a real challenge for all of us, because there are more and more on the market. You can buy a 3D printer. Are you pleased with that provision being included in the legislation? Because this is an issue that police officers and other law enforcement people are dealing with. Is there any thoughts you have on the ghost gun provision that's now in the bill that can aid us in the efforts of how we try to deal with the access to ghost guns and, of course, many of the parts that people are securing to build ghost guns in our country?
Yeah, so
maybe I'll just answer that question. Just switch back and forth a little bit, give her a break. I wanted to speak on that ghost gun issue because I know there's been a lot of discussion on the ghost gun issue. In the States, there's what's called 80% lowers and uppers, which are full metal guns, and you just go in and you just make a router hole and you've got yourself a handgun or a fully functional AR-15. You put the parts on and away you go. The 3D printed guns require a lot more parts and pieces to make them operate. And they're certainly, they can be built, but the people that are building them are being charged right now. I mean, we've got a couple of people in Saskatchewan as a result of our colleagues in Quebec that started a Canada-wide project and end up catching people in several provinces that were manufacturing these firearms. But that was one of the things I brought up, Senator, in my opening remarks. A lot of those prosecutions were a result of our good friends at Canada Border Services. They're able to track these parts coming in and starting to see a profile of individuals who are building a gun or other techniques that they use. My concern on the handgun freeze is that right now, people have the gun as whole, they can sell it, there's value in it, they can shoot it, they can enjoy it. But if they can't, they can certainly just strip the parts off of that gun. And there is in the legislation saying that it has to be sold to another licensed individual. But there's no serial numbers on any of those parts. So now you've actually created more parts that can eventually build more 3D guns. Because you need the metal barrel, you need the metal slide, you need the trigger mechanisms and so forth in order to make that 3D plastic gun work. And so, I think could there be more done on the 3D printed legislation? Maybe some tweaking in there to make it a little tighter. But right now, there's prosecutions. There's people in jail right now in Saskatchewan that can't even get bail who have built 3D guns. So, and again, they weren't building them to distribute. I don't believe there was more, they claim they did it out of curiosity. They wanted to build a gun. That'll be up for the courts to decide. It was still illegal. and they're in jail without bail. So I think there is certainly a legal framework right now to deal with 3D printed guns without bringing C21 to the fold.
But my point is, there are provisions in the bill that actually strengthens the hands of law enforcement, people like yourself and others who are dealing with this. So that was my question.
Yes. And to that point, I agree with that.
So let me ask you another question, because I've heard this in
Senator,
different
yes,
testimony. Oh,
Wait,
sorry.
We've run out of time. I'm
Okay.
afraid we have to move on. Senator Kuchar is next, and our final question will come from Senator Daska, who I've added to the list, and then we'll draw a line under it. So, Senator Kuchar.
I have a fascinating question to ask, but I'm going to cede my time to Senator Youssef because he was on a roll.
I just want to add, because I've heard this testimony by and I read your testimony, Dr. Byron, in the other place, that you've talked about family heirlooms, and I'm struggling, and please excuse my ignorance, because I don't necessarily know what a family heirloom are or is. And is there a way you can characterize very quickly, succinctly, that help me understand what you would describe? I know not everything is a family heirloom, but there's obviously some thinking in your capacity about what this might be.
So, well, I can give you a personal example. So, my great-grandfather was a handgun owner. My grandfather was a handgun owner. I have a picture of him, which I use in my displays quite frequently, of him on an indoor range in the 1950s. My father was a handgun owner, and I am a handgun owner. And we have firearms that have been handed down, and I even have pictures of these individuals with these guns. So that has, that's an example, one example of an heirloom. Another example is, for example, something that someone's perhaps father brought back or grandfather brought back from World War II, and it was a souvenir of his time in the war. And that firearm has been continued to be used in the family. More broadly, I speak to many people. Remember, Alberta is not the same as downtown Toronto. There are people who live by the old style of ranching. There are real cowboys in Alberta. I have one who works for me. And so, these are people whose grandfather settled the land and carried a handgun with him in the early days when it was legal to deal with predators perhaps attacking his cattle, and then that handgun has been passed on through the generations. And so these items mean a great deal to people, and it is devastating to them to think that they will be the last generation to own these.
Senator Dasko, you have the final question.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. My question is to Mr. Freeberg. Saskatchewan has some of the highest rates in the country of gun homicide and violence. Both in 2020 and 21, the highest rate of gun homicides was in Saskatchewan, and in 22, Saskatchewan was the second province with the highest rate. And gun-related crimes are extremely high in Regina. In 2020 and 21, Regina has rated perhaps the highest in the country. So couldn't a reasonable person like me and others conclude that there are too many guns in Saskatchewan? I guess my question would be, how would you explain these data to anyone? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, and I appreciate the statistics that you put through because they speak volumes. When we look at the firearms in Saskatchewan that are being used in these terrible tragedies that you're seeing, and we go to the police agencies and so forth, and actually right now we're actually going to be starting to inventory those firearms from those police agencies to use in our provincial lab. So we're actually going to be using them for our lab needs these firearms in order to operate. What we're seeing is it's long guns that are being modified. It's long guns, single shots, bolt action rifles, shotguns and so forth that are being modified, cut down. I mean, that's primarily what we're seeing. And we also recognize, and as was mentioned earlier, some of these earlier model firearms they were from the 50s, didn't even have a serial number on them, which is why we're really focusing our efforts on making sure that our firearms community is locking up their firearms safely, that they're licensed, and that they're following the rules. So what we did to make that work, which isn't being done anywhere else in the country, right, but they will be doing it shortly in Alberta as well, is we brought in the SAS Firearms Act. So what we did is we brought in legislation there that allows for the police to lay a charge that's not a criminal charge for things like unsafe storage, not having a license, not storing it properly in your vehicle, leaving it in the back seat of your truck or whatever on a hunting trip and then getting it stolen, because those are the ones that are getting diverted and going into these crimes that you're seeing in Regina and Saskatoon and elsewhere. Or the tragedy that we had up in Laloche with the young fellow who went into the school and shot. It was a shotgun that was left in a house with no trigger lock, no ammunition, and no one in the home had a license. So that's why we're working with partners to say, well, we need to change that paradigm, because this handgun ban isn't the issue. I mean, it's not the handguns that are getting stolen in Saskatchewan. Most of the firearms owners there are locking them up, especially now, because they can't get another one. So there are even more alarm systems, all the rest of the things that go around there. So we want to focus on the education side and then use our firearms legislation to make it easier for police to lay a charge. When they lay that charge, Mr. Bevan behind me now and our other team is going to be taking that charge over. We're going to be prosecuting it. But we're not going to be prosecuting it trying to put somebody in jail. We're going to prosecute it with alternative measures, education, send them back to school. Maybe they get an inspection. They have to have a safe put in their house. And if the next time they mess up, they're going to lose their guns completely. But the police are willing to lay those type of charges because it's not going to take them years. They can simply just lay the ticket and we'll deal with it in some fashion. And if the person doesn't want to comply, then we're going to refuse their license and they're going to get a $5,000 fine. But it's much better to try to do that through some education process, which is why we have this legislation that we've brought in recently. So we're hoping that will help with that issue, because it is a big concern to me.
So through greater safety of the gun owners, you think you can solve the problem?
If you can stop people from being able to steal those firearms, because they're certainly not going into a store with a PAL or an RPAL and buying them. I mean, they're either getting them through, some other illicit manner, but in Saskatchewan and other areas, it's predominantly the long guns that are being modified that we're seeing coming out on the street in those tragedies that you're seeing.
Chair, I think it's important to clarify, those are the correct statistics. Who is behind those crimes? It's the gangs.
And unlicensed gun owners.
So what I'm trying to get at is that it's really a significant gang activity in Saskatchewan, drugs, et cetera.
Gang-related, that's what we've always been saying. It's not the legal guys, it's
Correct.
the gang-related.
Correct.
The
I
bill
want that
doesn't
on
do
the
anything.
record.
All right,
Bill
colleagues.
does nothing to combat that.
Okay, colleagues, this brings us to the end of the panel. I want to thank Dr. Bryan and Dr. Bryant and Mr. Freeberg for your help, for your advice, and for the work that you do every day. And in your case, it is every day. We've learned today. You've helped us considerably, and I also want to thank our committee members around the table for bringing the best of every witness who's been before us today. It's been a very important day of learning for us.